Hey guys, tonight we begin with a potato. Not just any potato, the lumper. Watery, tasteless, nutritionally mediocre, and absolutely loathed by anyone who had a choice in the matter. It was the dietary equivalent of eating wet cardboard. And for roughly 3 million Irish people in the 1840s, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A single acre could feed a family of 6 for a year. Which sounds great until you realise that your entire existence depends on a temperamental root vegetable that's one fungal infection away from turning into black slime. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Irish Potato Famine wasn't just a famine. It was a slow-motion apocalypse disguised as agricultural failure, enabled by colonial indifference, and perfected by the kind of economic ideology that makes modern libertarians look compassionate. Between 1845 and 1852, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people died. Another million fled. Ireland's population dropped by roughly 25% in less than a decade. To put that in perspective, imagine if the entire state of Texas just ceased to exist. Everyone. Gone. Dead or scattered across the Atlantic in coffin ships that killed a third of their passengers before they reached shore. And here's the thing that'll keep you up at night. There was food. Plenty of it. Ireland was exporting grain, cattle, pigs, and butter throughout the famine. Ships loaded with oats and wheat sailed past starving villages. The British Empire, at the height of its power, watched millions die and decided that intervening would violate the sacred principles of free market economics. Because apparently, Adam Smith's invisible hand works better as a middle finger. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how an entire nation could be brought to its knees by a potato disease, we need to understand how Ireland became a one-crop economy in the first place. And for that, we need to talk about conquest, land theft, and the multi-century British hobby of making Ireland as miserable as possible. Ireland in the early 19th century was not, shall we say, thriving. Centuries of colonisation had turned the island into something resembling a massive agricultural plantation, except the people working it didn't even get the courtesy of being called slaves. They were tenants. Renters, technically free, which meant they had the freedom to starve without anyone technically owning them. The land ownership situation was baroque in its cruelty. Picture this. Roughly 10,000 Protestant landlords, many of whom lived in England and had never set foot in Ireland, owned virtually all the arable land. The Catholic Irish majority, about 80% of the population, owned basically nothing. They rented tiny plots from middlemen who rented from other middlemen, who rented from landlords who rented from other landlords, in a feudal pyramid scheme that would make a modern hedge fund manager weep with admiration. These plots were small, comically small. We're talking 1 to 5 acres for an entire family. You couldn't grow grain economically on that scale. Grain needs space, equipment, storage. It's a rich person's crop. But potatoes don't care about your poverty. They grow in terrible soil, they don't need fancy equipment, and they produce more calories per acre than any other crop available in 19th century Europe. A labourer with a spade, some seed potatoes, and a tiny plot of boggy land could grow enough food to keep his family alive. Notice I said alive, not comfortable, not healthy, not thriving. Alive. The Irish peasant diet in the 1840s was potatoes, milk, and whatever else you could scrounge. Some families ate potatoes 3 times a day, every day, year after year. An adult male labourer consumed 12 to 14 pounds of potatoes daily. That's roughly 40 to 50 potatoes. Per day. For breakfast you'd eat potatoes. For lunch potatoes. For dinner, if you were lucky, potatoes with milk. And if you were very lucky, potatoes with butter. Special occasions might feature potatoes with salt herring. Christmas was potatoes with extra butter and maybe some cabbage. The monotony was soul-crushing, but the potatoes kept you functional. Barely. They provided carbohydrates, some protein, vitamin C, and enough nutrients to prevent immediate death. Paired with buttermilk, you had a diet that could sustain hard manual labour, which was fortunate because the entire economy ran on hard manual labour. You'd wake up before dawn, eat a bucket of potatoes, work in the fields until dark, eat another bucket of potatoes, and collapse into a bed of straw. Then you'd do it again, every day, forever. Of course, this system had one tiny flaw. If anything happened to the potatoes, everyone died, and I do mean everyone. There was no backup plan, no savings, no food reserves, no diversified agriculture, just potatoes. Millions of people balanced on a knife's edge of subsistence, and the knife was made of a single cultivar of a South American root vegetable. The British, observing this situation, thought it was working fine. The Irish were producing massive amounts of grain, beef, pork, and butter for export to England. Rents were being collected, profits were being made. Sure, the Irish were eating nothing but potatoes, but that was their choice, wasn't it? Free market, invisible hand. If they wanted to eat something else, they could simply work harder and pay higher rents. Obviously. Except they couldn't. The rents were already crushing. Most tenant farmers paid their entire cash income as rent and survived entirely on the potatoes they grew in their own tiny garden plots. The grain they harvested, that went to the landlord. The pig they raised, sold to pay rent. The butter, the eggs, the vegetables, all sold. Everything sold. The only thing they kept was the potatoes, because potatoes were the only crop that produced enough food per acre to sustain a family on the microscopic plots they were allowed to farm. This is what economists call a monoculture dependency, what normal humans call a disaster waiting to happen, and what the Irish called our daily reality since we were born. By 1845, roughly 1/3 of Ireland's population was entirely dependent on potatoes. Another third was mostly dependent on potatoes. That's roughly 6 million people whose survival hinged on one crop. One variety. Grown in the same fields year after year, with no crop rotation because you needed every inch of land producing maximum calories. The soil was exhausted. The potatoes were genetically identical clones, which meant they had identical vulnerabilities. And in the summer of 1845, those vulnerabilities met their perfect predator. Phytophthora infestans, the potato blight, a water mould that sounds like a Harry Potter curse and functions like a biological weapon. It had appeared in the United States in 1843, probably imported from South America with potato shipments. By 1845 it had reached Europe, carried on winds and ships and the clothing of travellers. It arrived in Belgium, then France, then southern England, and in September 1845 it reached Ireland. The blight moved like a plague from a medieval nightmare. One day, your potato plants were green and healthy. The next day, they were blackened and rotting. The infection spread through fields at terrifying speed, carried by wind and rain. The leaves turned black, the stems collapsed. The potatoes in the ground transformed into putrid, stinking slime. An entire field could be destroyed in 48 hours. Contemporary accounts describe the smell. Dear God, the smell. Imagine if every potato in a 3-mile radius simultaneously died and began rotting. The air reeked of decay. Farmers would wake up to a stench like death itself had moved into the neighbourhood and refused to leave. And when they dug up their potatoes, desperately hoping to salvage something, they found black mush. Handfuls of diseased slime that slipped through their fingers like rotten flesh. The 1845 harvest was a partial failure. About 40% of the crop was destroyed, which sounds almost manageable until you remember that people were already subsisting on the bare minimum. Losing 40% meant losing 40% of your calories, and there was no surplus to fall back on. Families started going hungry immediately. By winter, people were eating diseased potatoes, rotten potatoes, anything that looked remotely edible. The first deaths from starvation were recorded in the autumn of 1845, though they were officially blamed on fever and dysentery, because admitting that British subjects were starving to death in large numbers was bad for the Empire's reputation. The British government, to its credit, did respond. Sort of. Prime Minister Robert Peel, a Tory who was generally less terrible than his colleagues, secretly purchased $100,000 worth of Indian corn from America. Maize. He had it shipped to Ireland and sold at cost through relief committees. This was actually a fairly reasonable response, and it probably saved thousands of lives. The problem was that the Irish had no idea how to prepare maize. You can't just boil it like potatoes. It needs to be ground into meal, and there weren't enough mills in Ireland to process it. When people tried to eat it improperly prepared, it caused digestive problems. They called it Peel's brimstone, but it helped. A little. Just enough to get through the winter. And in the spring of 1846, farmers planted potatoes again, because what else were they going to do? They had no money for other seeds, no knowledge of other crops, and no belief that the blight would return. Surely it was a one-time disaster. Surely God wouldn't let it happen again. God apparently wasn't taking calls. The summer of 1846 was wet and mild. Perfect conditions for Phytophthora infestans. The blight returned with a vengeance. This time, it destroyed virtually the entire crop. We're talking 90 to 95% loss. Almost nothing survived. Fields that had looked promising in July were blackened graveyards by August. The smell returned. The rot. The horror of watching your family's entire food supply dissolve into toxic sludge. And this time, there were no reserves left. People had eaten everything during the previous winter. They'd sold their possessions to buy food. They'd slaughtered their pigs, eaten their chickens, pawned their tools. There was nothing left. By autumn 1846, mass starvation had begun in earnest. This is where the story shifts from agricultural disaster to why do I hate the British government with the burning intensity of 1,000 suns. Because Robert Peel had been replaced as Prime Minister by Lord John Russell, a Whig who believed deeply in laissez-faire economics and the moral superiority of letting markets solve problems. Russell and his chief aide, Charles Trevelyan, decided that the famine was essentially a divine intervention to teach the Irish the virtues of self-reliance and modern agriculture. I'm not exaggerating. Trevelyan, in private correspondence, called the famine a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence that would teach the Irish not to be so dependent on potatoes. You read that correctly. 1 million dead, and the British official in charge of relief efforts thought it was good for their character development. Russell shut down Peel's relief programmes. He refused to interfere with the grain trade. He insisted that Ireland should be self-sufficient and that providing government aid would create dependency. Instead, he instituted a public works programme that employed starving people to build roads and break rocks in exchange for wages that were deliberately set below the cost of food. The theory was that this would prevent people from becoming lazy and relying on handouts. The reality was that skeletal, starving men were forced to perform hard physical labour in exchange for money that couldn't buy enough food to sustain the energy needed to do the labour. People died with their hands still gripping their shovels. They collapsed in the middle of breaking rocks and never got up. The public works programme killed people just as surely as the starvation itself, except it killed them with extra humiliation and exhaustion. And through all of this, Ireland continued exporting food. This is the part that makes your blood boil. In 1846 and 1847, while people were eating grass and seaweed and dying in ditches, Ireland exported over 9,000 calves, 186,000 sheep, 4,000 horses and ponies, over 30,000 pigs, and vast quantities of oats, wheat, barley and butter. Enough food to feed everyone who starved, easily. But that food wasn't Irish food. It belonged to the landlords, who demanded their rents. It was protected by armed guards and soldiers who escorted grain shipments from starving villages to ports, where it was loaded onto ships bound for England. Peasants who tried to steal food were transported to Australia or hanged. The laws protecting property were enforced with absolute rigour. The laws protecting human life were suggestions. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like on the ground, because the statistics don't capture the full medieval horror of it. Imagine you're a tenant farmer in County Cork in the winter of 1847. You're 35 years old, which means you're elderly by the standards of your class, and you have a wife and 4 children. Your potato crop has failed for 2 consecutive years. You have no food, no money, no possessions left to sell. You wake up in your one-room cottage, which is basically a stone shed with a dirt floor and a hole in the roof for smoke. Your children are crying, but weakly now. because they don't have energy for real crying anymore. Their bellies are distended from hunger. Their skin is translucent. They look like tiny skeletons wrapped in wet paper. Your wife is trying to make soup from nettles and grass. It provides no nutrition whatsoever, but it fills the stomach temporarily and creates the illusion of having eaten. You've been eating this for weeks. Your gums are bleeding from scurvy. Your body has started consuming its own muscle tissue. You can barely stand. But you have to stand, because if you don't work on the public works project, you don't get paid. And if you don't get paid, you don't get the pittance that might buy a handful of Indian meal. So you drag yourself to the road building site and lift rocks for 8 hours in the freezing rain while your body slowly cannibalizes itself. When you come home, one of your children has died. Your wife is too weak to cry. You can't afford a coffin, so you wrap the tiny body in rags and carry it to the mass grave that's been dug outside the village. There are already dozens of bodies there, piled on top of each other, many of them naked because their families sold their clothes for food. The priest says a few words. He's skeletal too. Everyone is skeletal. The village looks like a concentration camp, though that term won't exist for another century. You go home, you eat your nettle soup, you lie down on the dirt floor next to your 3 remaining children and pray that you'll wake up in the morning. Some nights, you don't want to wake up. Some nights, death seems like relief. That was the daily reality for hundreds of thousands of families. The British government, observing this nightmare, decided what Ireland really needed was soup. Not good soup, not nutritious soup, but soup that was technically food-like substance that could be distributed efficiently and cheaply. They opened soup kitchens in 1847, which sounds charitable until you learn about the rules. First, you had to prove you were completely destitute. Not just poor, not just hungry, utterly destroyed. You had to surrender any land you held, abandon any remaining possessions, and basically declare yourself a non-person before you qualified for soup. The theory was that this would prevent people who weren't truly starving from taking advantage of free food. The reality was that people avoided the soup kitchens until they were literally dying, because accepting soup meant losing everything. Second, the soup was deliberately made as unappealing as possible to discourage dependency. It was watery, tasteless, and nutritionally inadequate for people who were already starving. Some kitchens served what was essentially hot water with a few grains of rice floating in it. Others provided stirabout, which was Indian meal mixed with water into a lumpy paste that had the texture of wallpaper adhesive and the flavour of despair. But it was something. At their peak in the summer of 1847, the soup kitchens were feeding about 3 million people daily. 3 million. 1/3 of Ireland's entire population was being kept alive by government soup kitchens, serving food that wouldn't be acceptable in a modern prison. And the British government resented every penny spent on it. By autumn 1847, they shut the soup kitchens down. The potato crop had partially recovered, which the government interpreted as crisis over, back to normal. Never mind that people had no seed potatoes to plant, no money to buy them, and no strength to cultivate fields. Never mind that the partial recovery meant maybe 30% of a normal harvest, and people needed 100% to survive. The government looked at the situation and said, "Seems fine, let's stop spending money on this." From that point forward, relief was handled through the poor law system and the workhouses. If you were starving, you could enter a workhouse, which was basically a prison for poor people. You'd be separated from your family, men in one wing, women in another, children in a third. You'd be given barely enough food to survive and forced to perform meaningless labour like breaking rocks or picking oakum, unravelling old rope into fibres. You'd sleep in overcrowded dormitories where disease spread like wildfire, and you'd never be allowed to leave unless you could prove you had means of support outside. The workhouses became death traps. They were overwhelmed within months. Buildings designed for 200 people were housing 1,000. There was no sanitation, no ventilation, no medical care. Typhus, dysentery and cholera ravaged the inmates. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Some workhouses had mortality rates above 50%. You'd enter hoping for food and shelter, and you'd die of fever within weeks, your body dumped in a mass grave with dozens of others. And if you refused to enter the workhouse, If you tried to stay in your home and survive on your own, well, that's when the landlords got involved. See, the landlords were facing their own crisis. Not a starvation crisis, obviously, a financial crisis. Their tenants couldn't pay rent because their tenants were dead or dying. The land was sitting there, not generating income, and under British law, landlords were responsible for paying poor rates, taxes, for any tenant who held land valued under 4 annually, which was most of them. So the landlords did what any rational economic actor would do. They evicted everyone. The evictions began in earnest in 1847 and continued through the early 1850s. Landlords and their agents would arrive at cottages with bailiffs and sometimes soldiers. They'd give families minutes to leave. Sometimes they didn't even give minutes. They'd just start tearing down the cottage while the family was still inside. They'd rip off the roof, knock down walls, destroy everything so the land could be consolidated into larger farms or converted to pasture for cattle. Families would stand in the ruins of their homes watching their possessions being destroyed with nowhere to go. They'd built these cottages themselves, often with their own hands, using stones from the fields. These weren't just houses. They were the physical manifestation of generations of labour, and they were being demolished by men who'd never done a day's physical labour in their lives, and who believed this was sound economic policy. The evicted families had 3 options, all of them terrible. They could enter the workhouse, where they'd probably die of fever. They could try to survive on the roads, begging and scavenging, where they'd probably die of starvation or exposure. Or they could emigrate, which meant boarding a ship that might or might not reach its destination, and even if it did, you'd arrive in a foreign country with no money, no connections and no skills beyond subsistence potato farming. Let's talk about the ships. The coffin ships, they called them, which was not an exaggeration. Between 1846 and 1855, roughly 1.5 million people left Ireland. Most of them went to the United States, Canada or Britain. Many of them never arrived. The emigrant ships were cargo vessels repurposed for human transport, which is exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Ship owners realised they could make enormous profits by cramming desperate people into holds designed for goods. There were minimal regulations and almost no enforcement. A ship that had crossed the Atlantic carrying lumber would return carrying Irish emigrants, packed into the same spaces where the lumber had been, with basically no modifications for human occupancy. The conditions were medieval. Passengers were crammed into spaces between decks that were sometimes less than 6 feet high. There was no sanitation beyond a few buckets, no ventilation, no privacy, no fresh water beyond your daily ration, no fresh food. You brought your own provisions, usually oats or Indian meal, and you cooked them yourself on deck if the weather permitted, which it often didn't. If you ran out of food mid-voyage, too bad. You starved. The crossings took anywhere from 40 days to 3 months, depending on winds and weather. Imagine spending 3 months in a dark, fetid, overcrowded cargo hold that reeks of unwashed bodies, vomit, and excrement. Imagine being so tightly packed that you can't lie flat. Imagine being already weakened from starvation, then being tossed around by storms while seasick and dehydrated. Imagine watching your children die and having to keep their bodies with you, because there's no space to store them and the crew won't come below deck to collect them. On some ships, 1/3 of the passengers died during the voyage. On the worst ships, it was closer to half. Typhus was the main killer. Ship fever, they called it. It spread through the cramped conditions like a biblical plague. You'd wake up with a fever and a headache. Within days, you'd be delirious. Within a week, you'd be dead. The only mercy was that you probably wouldn't remember most of it. The ones who survived the voyage weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. When ships landed in Quebec, the healthy passengers were allowed off first. Then came the sick, who were quarantined on Grosse Isle, a small island in the St. Lawrence River that functioned as a death trap disguised as a quarantine station. The facilities were overwhelmed within weeks of the first famine ships arriving. Sick immigrants were left lying on the beaches because there was no room in the fever sheds. Medical staff were dying of typhus themselves. Bodies were buried in mass graves, often without anyone recording their names. In 1847 alone, roughly 5,000 Irish immigrants died on Grosse Isle. Another 20,000 died on the ships approaching it or shortly after landing. That's 25,000 deaths in a single summer, just in Canada. The United States had similar mortality rates at ports like New York and Boston. Britain refused to accept most famine immigrants, though thousands made it to Liverpool anyway and died in the slums there. The survivors, and there were survivors, hundreds of thousands of them, faced discrimination, poverty and exploitation in their new homes. No Irish need apply signs appeared in windows across America. The Irish were considered racially inferior, prone to drunkenness and violence, Catholic in Protestant nations, and willing to work for wages that undercut native workers. They were crammed into urban slums, worked brutal jobs, and died young from industrial accidents and disease. They'd escaped the famine only to face different forms of misery, but at least they'd escaped. The ones who stayed in Ireland faced a different kind of slow death. By 1848, the blight had eased somewhat. The potato crops of 1848 and 1849 were partially successful, producing maybe 50 to 60% of normal yields, which sounds hopeful until you remember that normal was barely enough to survive on, and now there were fewer people to eat them because millions had died or emigrated. But those who remained had no resources to work with, no seed, no money, no strength. The recovery was agonizingly slow. The blight returned in 1849, not as severely as 1846, but severe enough to destroy hope. Just when people thought they might survive, just when they'd started to rebuild, the potatoes rotted again. This happened year after year. Partial recovery, then failure. Success, then blight. It was like being tortured by someone who occasionally loosened the ropes just enough to let you think you might escape, then tightened them again. The psychological toll was immense. You can see it in the contemporary accounts. People stopped hoping. They stopped planning. They developed what we'd now recognise as severe depression and trauma. Mothers stopped trying to soothe their crying children because there was nothing they could do. Fathers stopped looking for work because there was no work. Families sat in their cottages waiting to die, too exhausted to even attempt survival. The landscape transformed into something from an apocalyptic nightmare. Entire villages were abandoned. Cottages stood empty, their roofs collapsed, their walls crumbling. Fields that had been cultivated for generations returned to wilderness. The roads were lined with beggars, though calling them beggars implies they had the energy to ask for help. Mostly they just sat or lay by the roadside, waiting. Sometimes you couldn't tell if they were alive or dead until you got close enough to check. Mass graves appeared on the outskirts of every town and village. Famine pits, they called them. Trenches where bodies were dumped by the dozens, sometimes without even being wrapped in shrouds. The gravediggers couldn't keep up. Bodies would lie in the streets for days before someone collected them. The smell of death hung over the country like fog, and through all of this the British government maintained that they were doing everything reasonable, and that further intervention would violate economic principles and create dependency. Charles Trevelyan, the man in charge of relief efforts, actually published an essay in 1848 arguing that the famine was proof of God's wisdom and that it would ultimately benefit Ireland by forcing modernisation and reducing overpopulation. He was knighted for his work. Knighted. For presiding over the deaths of 1 million people and then writing an essay about how it was actually good. The Catholic Church, to its credit, tried to help. Parish priests distributed what aid they could, sheltered the sick, and buried the dead. Many priests died of fever contracted while administering last rites, but the Church's resources were limited, and its help came with strings attached. To receive aid from many Catholic charities, you had to attend Mass, take communion, and demonstrate proper Catholic piety. If you were Protestant, or if you'd lapsed from the faith, you might be turned away. Religious sectarianism continued even in the midst of apocalypse, because humans are remarkable in their ability to maintain petty distinctions while the world burns. The Protestant churches also provided aid, but often with the explicit goal of conversion. This was the era of superism. Protestant missionaries would set up soup kitchens and schools, offering food and education in exchange for conversion. Some desperate Catholics took the deal, becoming known as supers, a term that carried intense social stigma. They'd traded their faith for survival, and neither community forgave them for it. The Catholics saw them as traitors. The Protestants saw them as opportunistic converts who couldn't be trusted. Meanwhile, international aid was pouring in. The Ottoman Sultan sent $10,000 and ships loaded with food. The Choctaw Nation, themselves victims of forced removal and genocide, collected $170 and sent it to Ireland. That's $170 from a people who had nothing, who'd been marched at gunpoint from their homeland and watched their own families die, and they still found it in themselves to help strangers across an ocean. The gesture was worth more than the money itself. It was solidarity between the dispossessed. Queen Victoria donated $2,000, which sounds generous until you learn she'd spent $500,000 on a royal yacht the previous year. She made a brief visit to Ireland in 1849, sailing along the coast and commenting on how picturesque it was. She didn't go inland. She didn't visit the workhouses or the mass graves or the destroyed villages. She saw Ireland from the comfort of her yacht, pronounced it charming, and sailed away. The British press covered the famine extensively, with illustrations of skeletal children and emaciated adults filling newspapers. This generated some public sympathy and charitable donations, but it also generated resentment. Many British people believed the Irish were exaggerating their suffering to extract more aid. They thought the Irish were naturally lazy and improvident, and that the famine was essentially their own fault for being dependent on potatoes. This wasn't some fringe opinion. It was mainstream British thought, repeated in Parliament, printed in newspapers, and taught in schools. The Irish were racially inferior, culturally backward, and needed to be civilised through suffering. The famine was unfortunate but ultimately beneficial. It would teach them self-reliance. It would force them to abandon subsistence farming and embrace modern agricultural methods. It would reduce the population to sustainable levels. This ideology wasn't accidental. It was the logical conclusion of British colonial policy in Ireland, which had always treated the Irish as subjects to be managed rather than citizens to be protected. The Irish Parliament had been abolished in 1801, merged with Westminster in the Act of Union. The Irish had no meaningful political representation, no control over their own economy, and no legal recourse when British policies destroyed their lives. They were a colony pretending to be part of the United Kingdom, and the famine revealed the lie. The anger this generated would shape Irish history for the next century. The Young Ireland movement, a nationalist group advocating for Irish independence, attempted a rebellion in 1848. It failed spectacularly. Turned into a fistfight and a cabbage patch, basically. But it represented the beginning of organised Irish resistance to British rule. The famine had radicalised a generation. People who'd been willing to accept British rule when times were hard became revolutionaries when they realised British rule was actively killing them. The rebellion was crushed easily, its leaders transported to Australia or hanged, but the sentiment remained. The famine had created a permanent break between Ireland and Britain. Before 1845, Irish nationalism was mostly cultural, a desire to preserve the Irish language, celebrate Irish history, maintain Irish traditions. After 1852, it became existential. The British government had watched 1 million people die and done nothing, had in fact actively prevented relief efforts that might have saved lives, had exported food while people starved, had evicted families during the worst of the crisis. This wasn't governance, it was genocide by policy decision. And that word, genocide, is where we need to pause and have an uncomfortable conversation. Because historians argue about this, vigorously, passionately, sometimes angrily. Was the Irish Potato Famine a genocide? Or was it simply an agricultural disaster exacerbated by incompetence and ideology? The traditional British position, maintained well into the 20th century, was that the famine was an act of God, a natural disaster. Nobody could have predicted a potato blight. Nobody could have prevented it. The British government did everything reasonably possible under the circumstances, and while the death toll was tragic, it wasn't anyone's fault. This view has the advantage of absolving everyone involved, and the disadvantage of being complete nonsense. The Irish nationalist position, developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was that the famine was deliberate mass murder, The British government knew people were starving and chose to let them die. They continued exporting food while people ate grass. They evicted families in the middle of winter. They set up systems designed to humiliate and degrade rather than to help. The death toll wasn't tragic. It was intentional. This view has the advantage of capturing the rage and grief of survivors, and the disadvantage of being difficult to prove legally. Modern historians mostly land somewhere in between, which is unsatisfying but probably accurate. The famine wasn't deliberately engineered to kill Irish people, but British policy decisions made it far worse than it needed to be, and those decisions were influenced by racist attitudes about Irish inferiority and economic ideology that valued property rights over human lives. It was a crime, certainly. Whether it meets the legal definition of genocide is debatable, and depends on which definition you use and how much weight you give to intent versus outcome. Here's what we know for certain. There was enough food in Ireland to feed everyone. The British government had the resources and power to prevent mass starvation. They chose not to use that power because they genuinely believed, that market forces should be allowed to operate without interference, and that providing relief would create dependency and moral weakness. They let ideology override compassion, and 1 million people died as a result. You can call that genocide, or you can call it criminal negligence, or you can call it ideologically motivated mass death. The bodies don't care what term you use, they're still dead. By 1850, the worst was over. The blight continued to appear sporadically through the 1850s, but never with the same intensity as 1846. The potato gradually returned as a reliable crop, though farmers learned to diversify and plant multiple varieties. The population continued to fall, not through starvation now, but through emigration. People left in waves, generation after generation, seeking opportunities that didn't exist in Ireland. The landscape was permanently changed. Entire regions were depopulated. The Irish language, which had been the primary language in many western counties, nearly died out. English became dominant not through policy but through population replacement. The Irish speakers died or emigrated, and English speakers moved in, or were simply the only ones left. Traditional Irish culture, already weakened by centuries of British rule, suffered another catastrophic blow. The landlord system continued for several decades, though it was gradually reformed. The Land Acts of the late 19th century allowed tenants to purchase their land, breaking up the massive estates. But this came too late for the famine generation. The people who'd been evicted, who'd watched their children starve, who'd survived the coffin ships, they got no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement that what had happened to them was wrong. The Catholic Church emerged from the famine stronger than before. It had been present during the crisis, offering what comfort it could, while the British government had been absent. This contrast wasn't lost on the survivors. The Church became the symbol of Irish identity and resistance, the institution that had stayed when everyone else had fled. Catholic devotion intensified. Religious practice became more rigid, more conservative, more central to Irish life. The famine had killed 1 million people, but it had also killed the casual folk Catholic spirituality that had characterised pre-famine Ireland, replacing it with an institutional Catholicism that would dominate Irish life for the next century and a half. The emigrant communities, meanwhile, were building new lives and nursing old grievances. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and other American cities, Irish immigrants clustered in neighbourhoods, preserved their culture, and remembered the famine. They told their children and grandchildren about the starvation, the evictions, the coffin ships. They formed organisations like the Fenian Brotherhood and Clan na Gael, dedicated to Irish independence. They raised money, smuggled weapons, and planned rebellions that would be carried out by people who'd never actually lived in Ireland but who'd inherited the rage of the famine generation. This is how historical trauma works. It doesn't dissipate, it transmutes. The people who experienced the famine directly mostly died without seeing justice, but their children, who'd heard the stories, and their grandchildren, who'd inherited the anger, carried it forward. The famine became the foundational grievance of Irish nationalism, the proof that British rule was illegitimate and murderous, the justification for armed resistance. Every Irish rebellion from 1867 onward drew on famine memory. Every nationalist argument invoked the million dead. Every radical who threw a bomb or fired a rifle did so in the name of people who died 50 years earlier. The British, predictably, didn't understand this. They'd moved on. The famine was ancient history. Why were the Irish still so angry? It was a natural disaster that happened decades ago. Why couldn't they just get over it and be grateful for the civilizing influence of British rule? This is, of course, exactly the kind of logic that guarantees your subjects will never stop hating you. You don't get to commit atrocities and then complain when people remember them. You don't get to watch 1 million people die through your inaction and then act surprised when their descendants want independence. The British government created the conditions for endless rebellion and then wondered why. Rebellion kept happening. Let's talk about some specific people, because statistics don't capture suffering and we need to understand this on a human level. There are thousands of documented stories from the famine, preserved in relief committee records, emigration documents, court proceedings, and family histories. Most are fragmentary, a name in a ledger, a brief notation about death or emigration, a line in a newspaper. But some are detailed enough to reconstruct individual experiences. Take John Connor, a small farmer from County Clare. We know about him because his eviction was documented in the Clare Journal in February 1848. Connor held 5 acres, which he farmed with his wife and 6 children. He paid $5 annually in rent. When the potato crop failed in 1846, he couldn't pay. His landlord, a man named Marcus Keane who lived in London and had never visited his Irish estates, ordered him evicted. The bailiffs arrived on a February morning when the temperature was below freezing. They gave Connor and his family 15 minutes to remove their possessions. Connor protested. Where were they supposed to go? The bailiffs didn't care. That wasn't their problem. They began dismantling the cottage while the family was still gathering their things. They ripped off the roof thatch, knocked down one wall, made the structure uninhabitable. The Connor family stood in the ruins with their possessions, a few pots, some clothes, a wooden chest. 8 people, including an infant and an elderly grandmother. They had no money, no relatives who could take them in, and nowhere to go. The nearest workhouse was 15 miles away and already overcrowded. The newspaper account ends there. We don't know what happened to the Connors. They probably died, either on the roads or in the workhouse. Maybe some of them emigrated, maybe some survived, but the fact that their eviction was documented at all makes them unusual. Thousands of families were evicted with no record made, no newspaper coverage, no acknowledgement that they'd ever existed. Or consider Margaret Donoghue, who appears in the records of the Skibbereen Relief Committee in County Cork. Skibbereen was one of the worst hit areas, where entire townlands were depopulated. Margaret was 28 years old in 1847. She had 3 children under the age of 5. Her husband had died of fever the previous winter. She had no land, no money, and no way to feed her children. The Relief Committee notes state that when she applied for aid in January 1847, she was in a state of advanced starvation. Her children were described as skeletal, with distended bellies and sores covering their bodies. The committee provided her with meal and a small amount of money. 2 weeks later, she returned. One of her children had died. She needed help burying the body. The committee notes, in the dispassionate language of bureaucracy, that they provided her with a coffin and cart. No money this time. The committee was low on funds. A month later, Margaret returned again. Another child had died. Again, a coffin and cart. No additional aid. The committee was overwhelmed. Margaret Donoghue's name disappears from the records after March 1847. We don't know if she survived. We don't know what happened to her remaining child. We don't know if she emigrated, died, or simply moved to another townland where she wouldn't be documented. She exists in history as a few lines in a relief committee ledger, 3 requests for help across 3 months, and then nothing. Multiply that story by hundreds of thousands. That's the famine. Not statistics about crop yields and death rates. People. Individuals with names and faces and stories, all erased by hunger and disease and a government that decided their lives weren't worth the cost of intervention. The children were the worst. Contemporary accounts fixate on the children, and you can understand why. Adults could rationalize their suffering. This is politics, this is history, this is the way the world works. Children couldn't rationalize anything. They just knew they were hungry and nobody was feeding them. Quaker relief workers, who were some of the few people actually trying to help without religious or political strings attached, left detailed accounts of what they saw. They described children with stick-thin limbs and swollen bellies, too weak to cry, lying in corners of cottages waiting to die. They described 7-year-olds who looked like elderly people, their faces ancient with suffering. They described orphans wandering the roads, sometimes eating grass or bark, sometimes too far gone to eat at all, just walking because walking was the only thing left to do. The Quakers tried. They really did. They set up soup kitchens, distributed clothing, organised relief committees. They spent their own money, exhausted themselves, and saved thousands of lives. But they couldn't save everyone. The scale of the disaster was too large. The government opposition was too strong. The ideology that prevented effective relief was too entrenched. The Quakers could offer soup. They couldn't overthrow an economic system. William Bennett, a Quaker from England who toured the west of Ireland in 1847, wrote an account that was published in newspapers across Britain. He described entering a cabin in County Mayo and finding 6 people inside, all too weak to stand. The cabin had no furniture, no possessions, no food. The floor was dirt covered with wet straw. The smell was indescribable. Unwashed bodies, decay, death. Bennett asked if they needed help. The question was absurd, but he didn't know what else to say. One of them, a woman, though he couldn't tell her age, said they needed food. Bennett had brought some bread. He gave it to them and watched them eat. They ate slowly, mechanically, without enjoyment. They were beyond hunger, in that state where food is no longer pleasure, just fuel for a body that's already begun shutting down. Bennett left money with the local priest to buy more food for the family. When he returned 2 weeks later, 4 of them were dead. The remaining 2 had moved on, presumably to die somewhere else. The cabin was empty, door hanging open, already beginning to decay back into the landscape. These accounts were published. People read them, Parliament read them, the Queen read them, and the response was, essentially, yes, very sad, but we mustn't interfere with market forces. Let's be clear about what market forces meant in this context. It meant protecting the property rights of landlords who lived in England and had never met their tenants. It meant ensuring that grain merchants could sell their goods at maximum profit without government price controls. It meant maintaining the sanctity of contracts and rents, even when enforcing those contracts caused death. It meant, fundamentally, deciding that abstract economic principles were more important than human lives. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't incompetence. This was choice. The British government chose markets over people. They chose ideology over compassion. They chose to let 1 million people die rather than violate their economic theories. And they did it while congratulating themselves on their moral superiority and fiscal responsibility. Charles Trevelyan, remember, was knighted. Queen Victoria gave him a medal. He was praised in Parliament for his efficient administration of famine relief. Efficient. The man presided over one of the largest demographic catastrophes in European history, and his peers thought he'd done a good job. That tells you everything you need to know about British attitudes toward Ireland. The efficiency Trevelyan was praised for was the efficiency of death. He ran the relief programmes like a business, minimising costs and maximising returns. Returns in this case meant a number of Irish people who learned not to depend on potatoes, rather than number of Irish people kept alive. The goal wasn't survival. The goal was social engineering through starvation. If 1 million people had to die to modernise Irish agriculture and reduce overpopulation, well, that was the price of progress. This is how genocides happen, by the way. Not through explicit orders to kill, but through policy decisions that create the conditions for mass death, and then refusing to intervene. You don't need death camps when you can achieve the same result through evictions, export policies, and inadequate relief. You don't need to pull the trigger when you can just take away the food and let nature do the work. And you don't need to feel guilty because you can tell yourself you were just following economic principles and really it's the victim's fault for being so dependent on a single crop. The British government never apologised, not during the famine, not after, not ever. To this day, there's no official acknowledgement that British policy contributed to the death toll. The closest anyone came was Tony Blair in 1997, who issued a statement saying the government's response had been inadequate. Inadequate. 1 million dead, and 150 years later, the best you get is inadequate. Meanwhile, Ireland was fundamentally, permanently changed. The population never recovered. Even today, Ireland's population is smaller than it was in 1841. Think about that. It's been 180 years, and there are still fewer people living in Ireland than there were before the famine. The island was so thoroughly devastated, the society so completely disrupted, that population growth never returned to previous levels. Part of this was continued emigration. Even after the famine ended, Irish people kept leaving. Why wouldn't they? There were no opportunities. The land was exhausted. The economy was controlled by British interests. You could stay and struggle on a small farm, or you could leave and potentially build something better in America or Australia. Millions made that choice. Every generation lost its young people to emigration. Every family had relatives abroad. Every village had empty houses where families used to live. The cultural impact was equally profound. The Irish language, which had been spoken by roughly half the population in 1841, was spoken by less than a quarter by 1851. The famine had disproportionately killed Irish speakers, who tended to be poorer and more rural. The survivors, traumatised by their association with poverty and death, often refused to teach their children Irish. They saw it as the language of suffering and backwardness. English was the language of opportunity and survival. Within 2 generations, Irish had become a minority language, spoken mainly in remote western areas. Today it's technically the first official language of Ireland, but almost nobody speaks it fluently in daily life. The famine killed the language as effectively as it killed the people. Traditional Irish music and oral culture suffered similarly. The famine generation took their songs and stories to the grave. Some survived through emigrant communities, preserved in Boston and New York and Chicago. But the living tradition in Ireland itself was broken. What exists today is reconstruction, revival, preservation, valuable and important, but not the same as unbroken tradition. The famine also changed Irish marriage patterns and social structures. Before 1845, the Irish married young and had large families. After 1852, marriage ages increased dramatically. People waited longer, had fewer children, and many never married at all. This wasn't coincidence. It was trauma response. Why have children when children starve? Why marry when you can't feed a family? Why build a future when the future is this uncertain? Ireland became a country of bachelors and spinsters, late marriages and small families. The population declined not just through death and emigration, but through people choosing not to reproduce. The famine had killed the optimism that makes people willing to bring children into the world. It created a culture of caution, pessimism, and resignation that persisted for generations. The Catholic Church's influence grew partly because it was one of the few stable institutions people could trust, but it also grew because the Church encouraged this new conservatism. Large families were still promoted, but sexuality was increasingly controlled and suppressed. Joy became suspect. Pleasure became dangerous. The Church that emerged from the famine was more rigid, more authoritarian, more focused on sin and suffering than the relatively relaxed pre-famine Church. The famine didn't just kill people, it killed aspects of culture that might have developed differently in other circumstances. And then there's the psychological legacy, which is harder to measure but impossible to ignore. The famine created what psychologists would now recognise as intergenerational trauma. The survivors passed their fear and grief to their children, who passed it to their children, who passed it to theirs. Irish culture became characterised by a deep anxiety about food, money and security. Waste became a sin. Saving became mandatory. Trust in institutions evaporated. The default assumption became that authority would fail you when you needed it most, because that's exactly what had happened. This manifests in strange ways even today. Irish people of a certain generation cannot throw away food. Cannot. You eat everything on your plate. You save leftovers. You use every scrap. My grandmother, born in 1920, 70 years after the famine, would save single tea bags, half slices of bread, tablespoons of vegetables. Not because she was poor, she wasn't. Because the spectre of the famine hung over everything. What if the food runs out? What if there's nothing tomorrow? Better to save, just in case. Irish emigrants carried this trauma with them. The stereotype of the thrifty, penny-pinching Irish immigrant wasn't just stereotype. It was survival strategy learned from grandparents who'd lived through or heard first-hand accounts of starvation. You don't spend money frivolously when your grandmother told you about eating nettles to survive. You don't waste anything when your family history includes people dying with grass-stained mouths. The political legacy is more obvious. The famine created modern Irish nationalism. Before 1845, Irish identity was cultural and religious, but not necessarily separatist. Many Irish people were perfectly content being part of the United Kingdom, as long as they were treated fairly. The famine proved they would never be treated fairly. It proved that British rule meant death when it mattered, and it radicalised a generation. The Fenian movement in the 1860s, the Land War of the 1880s, the Easter Rising of 1916, the War of Independence in 1919 to 1921, all of these drew directly from famine memory. The revolutionaries weren't people who'd experienced the famine personally. They were the children and grandchildren of survivors, raised on stories of starvation and eviction, taught that British rule was illegitimate and murderous. The famine was the original sin that justified every subsequent act of rebellion. When Patrick Pearse stood outside the General Post Office in Dublin in 1916 and read the proclamation of the Irish Republic, he was speaking for the famine dead. When Michael Collins fought the British in the War of Independence, he was avenging his great-grandparents who died in the workhouses. When Ireland finally achieved independence in 1922, it was the culmination of a process that had begun with 1 million corpses and 1 million refugees. But independence didn't heal the wound, couldn't heal it. The Free State and later the Republic inherited a country that was still traumatised, still poor, still losing its young people to emigration. The famine had broken something fundamental in Irish society, and political independence alone couldn't fix it. Ireland remained economically stagnant for decades, a backwater on the edge of Europe, exporting people and importing shame. It wasn't until the 1990s, 150 years after the famine, that Ireland began to truly recover. The Celtic Tiger economy transformed the country from agricultural poverty to modern prosperity in less than a generation. Suddenly, Ireland was wealthy. Suddenly, people were immigrating to Ireland instead of leaving. Suddenly, the famine seemed like ancient history, a tragedy that belonged to another era. But history doesn't work that way. The famine isn't ancient history. It's living memory transmitted through families. Every Irish person has ancestors who experienced it. Every Irish family has stories, however fragmentary, about who died and who fled and who somehow survived. The famine is in the Irish DNA, literally and figuratively. It shaped the population through death and emigration. It shaped culture through trauma. It shaped politics through rage. It's still here, still present, still influencing how Irish people see themselves and their relationship with Britain. Which brings us to the question that haunts every discussion of the famine. Could it have been prevented? And if so, why wasn't it? The answer to the first question is yes, obviously, easily. The blight couldn't have been prevented. That was an agricultural disease that nobody understood or could control in 1845. But the mass starvation could have been prevented, easily. The mechanisms existed, the resources existed, the food existed. What didn't exist was the political will. If the British government had banned food exports from Ireland, nobody would have starved. If they'd provided adequate relief without humiliating conditions, nobody would have starved. If they'd suspended rents and evictions, if they'd distributed the grain that was being exported, if they'd done literally anything to prioritise human life over property rights and economic ideology, the death toll would have been a fraction of what it was. Other countries face potato, blight in the 1840s. The Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Germany, they all had crop failures. None of them had mass starvation. None of them had death tolls remotely approaching Ireland's. Why? Because their governments intervened. They banned exports, controlled prices, distributed food, suspended taxes. They treated crop failure as an emergency that required emergency measures. They prioritised keeping their citizens alive over maintaining economic orthodoxy. The British government didn't do this because they didn't see the Irish as full citizens deserving of protection. They saw them as a problem population that needed to be managed and, if we're being honest, reduced. The famine was an opportunity to solve the Irish problem through attrition. Not explicitly, not through official policy, but through a series of decisions that had the same effect. This is what makes people use the word genocide. Because while nobody in the British government explicitly ordered the deaths of Irish people, they created the conditions that caused those deaths, and then prevented the measures that would have stopped them. They knew what was happening. They had detailed reports. The newspapers were full of accounts of mass starvation, and they decided repeatedly, consciously, to prioritise economic principles over human lives. Charles Trevelyan wrote in private correspondence that the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. He wasn't a fringe figure. He was the man in charge of relief efforts, and he genuinely believed that mass death was divinely ordained and ultimately beneficial. This wasn't ignorance. This was ideology meeting racism and producing catastrophe. The other British officials involved had similar views. They believed the Irish were racially and culturally inferior, prone to laziness and overpopulation, dependent on government aid. They believed that providing relief would make them more dependent and lazy. They believed that the famine would force Irish society to modernise and improve. They didn't want to kill the Irish. They just didn't care if the Irish died, and in some cases they thought their deaths would be beneficial to Ireland's long-term development. This is colonial logic at its purest. The colonised aren't fully human. Their suffering is regrettable but ultimately their own fault. Intervention would only make them weaker. Letting them die is actually doing them a favour by removing the unfit and forcing the survivors to become stronger. It's social Darwinism applied as government policy, and it kills just as effectively as bullets. So when people ask, was it genocide? The question isn't whether British officials explicitly wanted to kill Irish people. The question is whether they created conditions that cause mass death, knew those conditions were causing mass death, and chose not to intervene because they believed the Irish deserved to suffer, or that their suffering would be beneficial. And the answer to that question is clearly, unambiguously, yes. Whether that meets the specific legal definition of genocide under international law is a technical question that lawyers can argue about. But morally, ethically, historically, the British government is responsible for the deaths of roughly 1 million people through deliberate policy choices. They had the power to prevent it. They chose not to. That's murder on a national scale, whatever term you want to use for it. The long-term effects of the famine extended far beyond Ireland itself. The Irish diaspora, created largely by famine emigration, spread across the world and changed the countries they settled in. Irish Americans became a major political force in the United States, influencing everything from labour movements to urban politics to America's relationship with Britain. Irish communities in Britain, Canada, Australia and New Zealand maintained their cultural identity and their resentment of British rule. This had real political consequences. Irish American support for Irish nationalism, both moral and financial, was crucial to the independence movement. The money that funded the IRA in the 20th century came largely from Irish American communities that had never set foot in Ireland but had inherited the grudges of their ancestors. The famine created a global network of Irish identity defined by opposition to British rule, and that network influenced geopolitics for over a century. It also changed how other colonised peoples saw the British Empire. If Britain would let 1 million of its own subjects die rather than interfere with markets, what would they do to people they considered even more inferior? Indian nationalists, African independence movements, Caribbean activists. They all looked at the Irish famine and saw their own futures under continued British rule. The famine became evidence that the British Empire's claims of bringing civilization and progress were lies. that colonial rule was extraction and exploitation disguised as governance. The famine also influenced economic thought and policy. The ideological commitment to laissez-faire economics that exacerbated the famine was discredited, at least partially, by the obvious horror of its consequences. You couldn't look at 1 million dead bodies and say, the invisible hand of the market works in mysterious ways, without sounding like a sociopath. Later, British governments became more willing to intervene in famines and economic crises, though they never acknowledged that their policy in Ireland had been wrong. The famine shaped Irish literature and art for generations. Every major Irish writer dealt with it somehow, obliquely in Joyce, directly in poetry and drama, as historical backdrop in novels. It became the defining trauma of Irish identity, the event against which everything else was measured. Even writers born a century after the famine wrote in its shadow, processing its legacy, trying to understand what it meant for Irish identity and culture. The physical landscape of Ireland still bears scars. Abandoned villages, famine walls built as make-work projects, mass graves, ruined cottages slowly dissolving back into the earth. In western counties, you can still see the ridge patterns of lazy beds, the raised planting beds where potatoes were cultivated, covering hillsides that have been abandoned since the 1840s. The land remembers, even if people forget. There are famine memorials scattered across Ireland and the Irish diaspora. Bronze sculptures of skeletal figures, plaques listing the dead, museums documenting the disaster. These started appearing mainly in the late 20th century, as the famine became history rather than living memory, as people felt safe enough to commemorate rather than just endure. The memorials are moving, often powerful works of public art, but they also feel inadequate. How do you memorialise 1 million deaths? How do you represent suffering on that scale? In Dublin, there's a set of bronze statues along the River Liffey showing emaciated figures walking toward the docks, famine emigrants heading for the ships. The sculptures are haunting, skeletal figures that look barely human, caught in the act of leaving. Tourists take photos with them, which feels obscene but is probably inevitable. How else do you engage with historical trauma? How else do you remember? In Skibbereen, County Cork, which had some of the highest mortality rates, there's a famine graveyard where thousands are buried in unmarked mass graves. The site is simple, just grass and a few monuments, because there's nothing else you can do. You can't excavate. You can't identify the bodies. You can't give them individual graves. They're anonymous in death as they were ignored in life. Thousands of people reduced to a patch of grass and a plaque. The Great Famine Museum at Strokestown Park in County Roscommon is built on the estate of one of the landlords who evicted his tenants during the famine. The museum is excellent, detailed, honest, unflinching in its presentation of what happened. But there's something surreal about learning about mass evictions while standing in the landlord's beautiful manor house, surrounded by the luxury that rent payments funded. The contrast is so stark it becomes almost satirical. This is where the money went while people starved. Educational curriculum in Ireland now includes extensive coverage of the famine. Every Irish schoolchild learns about it, studies the statistics, reads first-hand accounts, visits museums or monuments. This is relatively recent. For much of the 20th century, the famine was taught minimally, as if it was too painful or controversial to fully examine. But contemporary Irish education doesn't shy away from it. The famine is presented as a defining event in Irish history, a catastrophe that shaped everything that came after. British education, by contrast, largely ignores it. The famine might get a paragraph in history, textbooks, if that. British students generally don't learn about their government's role in Irish starvation. They don't learn about the food exports or the evictions or the ideology that prioritised markets over lives. The famine is Irish history, not British history, even though British policy created it. This historical amnesia is convenient for Britain and infuriating for Ireland, where the memory remains raw. The relationship between Ireland and Britain is still complicated by famine legacy. Ireland is independent now, a prosperous EU member state with its own identity and interests. But the history remains. The resentment remains. the sense that justice was never done, that the guilty were never punished, that the victims were never properly acknowledged. Brexit reopened some of these wounds, reminding Irish people that Britain still doesn't fully understand or care about Irish concerns, still makes unilateral decisions that affect Ireland without consultation. The Northern Ireland question is also tied to famine memory, though indirectly. The partition of Ireland in 1922 left a significant Catholic minority in the north under British rule, and those Catholics inherited all the historical grievances of famine-era oppression. The troubles of the late 20th century weren't about the famine directly, but they were rooted in the same fundamental conflict: a colonised population resisting British rule, using violence because peaceful methods had historically failed. The famine was the original example of why Catholics couldn't trust British governance to protect their interests. Today, 180 years after the Blight first appeared, Ireland is a very different place. Wealthy, modern, secular, confident. The trauma isn't as visible. The population is growing again. Young people aren't emigrating at the same rates. The economy's strong. Dublin is cosmopolitan, full of tech companies and international immigrants. You could visit Ireland and never think about the famine except as museum exhibits and tourist monuments, but it's still there, in the way Irish people talk about food and money and security, in the political relationship with Britain, in the stories families tell, in the abandoned cottages you can still find if you walk off the main roads, in the population statistics that show Ireland never fully recovered its pre-famine numbers, in the DNA studies that show a population bottleneck in the mid-19th century, in the folk memory of suffering that gets passed down even when specific details are forgotten. The famine was a catastrophe, but it was also a choice, a series of choices made by people with power that prioritised property and ideology over human lives. Those choices killed 1 million people, scattered another million across the world, and traumatised a nation for generations. The British government made those choices deliberately, consciously, while knowing what the consequences would be. And they never apologised, never acknowledged. Wrongdoing, never faced justice for what they did. That's the real horror of the famine. Not that it happened, disasters happen, but that it was preventable, was prevented by people with the power to prevent it, who chose not to because they valued their economic theories and racial prejudices more than Irish lives. That's not tragedy, that's crime. And the fact that nobody was ever held accountable is its own form of ongoing injustice. The potato was just a potato, a vegetable. It didn't cause the famine. Policy caused the famine. Ideology caused the famine. Colonialism caused the famine. The British government, through action and inaction, through commission and omission, through what they did and what they refused to do, caused the famine. The potato just gave them the opportunity, and that's something worth remembering when people try to blame the victims or call it a natural disaster, or suggest that nobody could have prevented it. The famine was man-made. The deaths were policy decisions. The suffering was a choice. Britain chose markets over people, property over lives, ideology over compassion, and 1 million people died because of it. Let's get specific about the mechanics of starvation, because understanding how people actually died matters. It's easy to say they starved to death and move on, but starvation isn't quick and it isn't simple. It's a process, a slow shutdown of systems, and it's worth understanding what 1 million people actually experienced. First comes hunger. Real hunger. Not the I skipped lunch kind. This is the hunger that occupies your every thought, that makes your stomach cramp and your head ache, that keeps you awake at night. In the early stages of the famine, this is where most people lived. Constantly, painfully hungry, but still functional. You could work, you could move, you could think. You were just always, always hungry. Then comes the weakening. Your body starts consuming itself. First it burns through any fat reserves, which for Irish peasants in 1845 meant basically nothing. They had no fat to spare. Then it starts breaking down muscle tissue for energy. You lose strength. Tasks that were easy become difficult. Walking to the field exhausts you. Lifting a spade becomes a struggle. Your body is literally eating itself to stay alive. Around this point, you start experiencing cognitive effects, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, confusion. Your brain isn't getting enough glucose to function properly. Decisions become hard. Simple tasks require enormous mental effort. You might sit down to rest and forget why you sat down. You might start walking somewhere and forget where you were going. Your mind is failing along with your body. Then come the physical symptoms that mark advanced starvation. Your hair falls out, your teeth loosen, your gums bleed. Your skin develops sores that won't heal because your body has no resources for healing. Your face becomes skeletal, eyes sunken deep in your skull. Children develop the distinctive distended bellies of kwashiorkor, caused by protein deficiency and fluid retention. Adults develop edema, their legs and feet swelling with fluid their bodies can't process. You become susceptible to every disease and infection because your immune system has shut down. A cold that would normally be minor becomes pneumonia. A small cut becomes an infected wound. Lice and fleas that everyone had anyway become vectors for typhus and relapsing fever. The diseases kill you before the starvation does, often, but they only kill you because starvation has left you defenseless. In the final stages, you stop feeling hungry. Your body has given up sending hunger signals because there's no point. You become lethargic, barely able to move. You might experience delirium, seeing things that aren't there, talking to people who aren't present. Your body temperature drops because you're not generating heat. You feel cold all the time, even in summer. Then you die. Usually from heart failure, as your heart muscle has been consumed along with everything else, or from disease, or from exposure if you're on the roads, or from simply running out of whatever mysterious thing keeps a body functioning when everything else has failed. It takes weeks or months to starve to death, depending on your starting condition, and every day of those weeks is suffering. Multiply that experience by 1,000,000. That's what the famine was, not a statistic. 1,000,000 individual deaths, each one a slow torture, each one preventable. The regional variation in mortality rates tells its own story about British policy priorities. The west of Ireland, counties Mayo, Galway, Clare, Kerry, had the highest death rates, sometimes exceeding 30% of the population. These were the poorest counties, the most Irish-speaking, the most dependent on potatoes, the most remote from British administration. They were also the counties where landlord absenteeism was highest, and eviction rates were most brutal. Eastern Ireland, closer to Dublin and more integrated into the British economy, had lower mortality rates. Not because the blight was less severe, it wasn't, but because there was more economic diversity, more access to markets, more attention from administrators. If you were going to starve, it was better to starve near Dublin than in Western Mayo. At least near Dublin, someone might notice. The worst affected areas were the Gaeltacht regions, the Irish-speaking western counties. This wasn't coincidence. These were the areas that had been most resistant to British cultural influence, where traditional Irish society had persisted longest. The famine essentially destroyed these communities. The survivors emigrated or moved to English-speaking areas. The language died, the culture fragmented. Within a generation, these regions had been demographically and culturally transformed. Some specific places became synonymous with famine horror. Skibbereen, in County Cork, where mass graves held thousands of bodies and the streets were reportedly lined with corpses. Belmullet, in County Mayo, where the population dropped from 13,000 to 4,000 in less than 2 years. Shull, where the dispensary doctor reported treating 890 patients in a single day and finding entire families dead in their cottages. These places became symbols of suffering, their names appearing repeatedly in relief reports and newspaper accounts. The islands off the west coast, the Aran Islands, Achill Island, Cape Clear, suffered catastrophically. They were already marginal, dependent entirely on potatoes and fishing. When the potatoes failed, there was nothing. No alternative food sources, no relief committees, no workhouses within reach, no way off the islands except boats that might or might not come. People died in their cottages and weren't discovered for weeks. Entire families vanished. The islands were nearly depopulated, their populations dropping by 50 to 70%. Contrast this with Belfast and the industrialised northeast, which barely experienced famine at all. Belfast was a manufacturing centre integrated into British industry with diverse employment and food sources. The linen mills kept running, the shipyards kept building, workers earned wages that could buy imported food. The North East was part of the British industrial economy in a way the West never was, and that economic integration saved lives. This created a geographical division that still exists in Irish politics. The West, rural, Irish-speaking, agricultural, devastated by the famine, became the heartland of Irish nationalism. The North East, urban, English-speaking, industrial, relatively spared, remained more ambivalent about British rule and eventually became Northern Ireland. The famine literally split the country along lines that persist 180 years later. Let's talk about the workhouse system in more detail, because these institutions were central to British famine policy, and they were absolutely horrifying. The workhouses were based on the English poor law system, which had been extended to Ireland in 1838. The theory was that poverty was a moral failing that should be discouraged, so relief should be made as unpleasant as possible to motivate people to work harder. The workhouses were designed to be grim, deliberately. They looked like prisons. High walls, barred windows, locked doors. You entered through a forbidding gate, surrendered your possessions, and were immediately separated from your family. Men, women, and children were housed in different wings and rarely allowed contact. This wasn't accidental. It was meant to break up families and make the workhouse so unappealing that people would do anything to avoid it. Inside, the conditions were prison-like. You wore workhouse uniforms, rough cloth that marked you as a pauper. You slept in dormitories on wooden benches or straw mattresses. You ate in silence in vast dining halls. You worked at pointless tasks like breaking rocks or picking oakum, not because the work needed doing, but because idleness was considered morally corrupting. You were confined to the workhouse grounds and couldn't leave without permission. The food was deliberately inadequate. The Poor Law Commissioners had calculated the minimum number of calories needed to prevent death and set rations slightly above that level. Breakfast might be stir-about, oat porridge, or bread. Lunch might be soup and bread. Dinner might be more stir-about. No vegetables, no meat, no variety. Just enough to keep you alive and working, but not enough to restore health or strength. Before the famine, the workhouses were underused. Irish people avoided them because entering meant losing your land, your possessions, your family, and your dignity. You'd rather struggle on your own than enter the workhouse. But when the famine hit, people had no choice. By 1847, the workhouses were overwhelmed. Workhouses designed for 500 were holding 2,000. Every room was crammed with bodies. The dormitories had people sleeping on the floors because there weren't enough beds. The dining halls couldn't accommodate everyone, so people ate in shifts. The privies overflowed because hundreds of people were using facilities designed for dozens. The smell was indescribable. Unwashed bodies, overflowing toilets, illness, death. And disease ran rampant. Typhus, the main killer, spread through lice. When you cram thousands of lice-infested, malnourished people into tight quarters with no ability to wash or change clothes, typhus spreads like wildfire. You'd enter the workhouse hungry but healthy and die of typhus within a week. The workhouse infirmaries, bare rooms with straw mattresses where the sick were isolated, became charnel houses. People went in and didn't come out. The workhouse staff died at horrific rates. Doctors, nurses, guards, administrators. Many of them contracted typhus and died. Some workhouses lost multiple doctors in succession. Nobody wanted to work there, but someone had to, and those people paid with their lives. The workhouse chaplains, who administered last rites to the dying, had particularly high mortality rates. They were in constant contact with fever patients, and they died by the dozens. The children in the workhouses were especially pitiful. Orphans, mostly, their parents dead or disappeared. They were housed separately from adults, crammed into nurseries and dormitories. They received even less food than adults because the commissioners believed children needed fewer calories. Many were literally skeletal. Contemporary accounts describe children who looked like ancient old people, with wrinkled skin and vacant eyes, too weak to play or even cry. The orphans were sometimes rescued through emigration schemes. British and Irish authorities shipped thousands of orphan children to Australia, Canada, and America, presenting this as charity. The reality was more complicated. The children were indentured servants, sent to work for families who wanted cheap labour. Some were treated well, many weren't. They were torn from what remained of their families, shipped across the world, and set to work in unfamiliar places where they had no rights and no protection. The conditions in some workhouses became so bad that they attracted scandal even in Britain. The Lurgan workhouse in County Armagh was investigated in 1847 after reports of mass deaths. The inspectors found hundreds of children packed into rooms without heat or adequate food, many of them sick with fever, lying on floors in their own waste. The master of the workhouse was dismissed, but nothing changed. The same conditions existed in dozens of other workhouses. Lurgan just happened to get investigated. Some workhouse masters were genuinely trying to help and were overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Others were corrupt, stealing food meant for inmates and selling it for profit. Still others were simply incompetent, promoted to positions of authority because they were related to someone important, with no idea how to manage an institution or care for thousands of desperate people. The stories that came out of the workhouses are nightmarish. Women giving birth on workhouse floors because there was no space in the infirmary, children dying in their mothers' arms while the mothers were too weak to cry, old people sitting on benches staring at nothing waiting to die, fever patients hallucinating, screaming, trying to escape, bodies piling up because the death rate exceeded the burial capacity. The workhouse graveyards, famine pits really, were mass graves where bodies were dumped without ceremony or identification. Coffins were reusable. You'd be placed in a coffin with a hinged bottom, carried to the grave, and the bottom would open to drop you in. Then the coffin would be used for the next body. If there weren't enough coffins, you'd just be wrapped in your workhouse uniform or a sheet and thrown in. Sometimes not even that. Just naked bodies piled in trenches. Imagine being so desperate that you voluntarily enter one of these places. Imagine knowing what you're walking into. Disease, degradation, probable death. And deciding it's still better than staying outside. That's how bad things were. The workhouse was hell, and people chose it because the alternative was worse. The public works programs, the other major form of relief, were almost as bad. The idea was to employ starving men on infrastructure projects, building roads, draining bogs, breaking rocks, and pay them wages to buy food. This sounds reasonable until you learn the details. First, the wages were set deliberately low, too low to actually buy enough food to sustain the work they were doing. The theory was that higher wages would attract workers who weren't truly desperate and create dependency. The reality was that men worked until they physically collapsed and died. Second, the work was backbreaking. These weren't easy jobs. You were breaking rocks with a hammer, digging drainage ditches, building roads by hand in all weather. This required enormous physical effort, and the workers were already weakened by hunger. They were burning more calories doing the work than they could buy with their wages. Third, payment was irregular. You might work for weeks and not get paid because the administrator hadn't received funds from Dublin, or because the paperwork was delayed, or because someone was embezzling. Men worked on credit, hoping payment would come before they starved, and sometimes it didn't. Fourth, the work was often pointless. Famine roads, they're called now. Roads that go nowhere, built purely to provide employment. You can still see them in Western Ireland. Roads that start in one townland and end in the middle of a bog, serving no purpose except to have provided work for men who are now dead. Some of the work was actively counterproductive, draining wetlands that should have been preserved, building walls that would collapse within years, moving rocks from one pile to another. The public works employed hundreds of thousands at their peak in 1847. The roads were lined with skeletal men performing labour their bodies couldn't sustain. Contemporary observers described scenes of men fainting while working, men collapsing with their tools still in their hands, men dying and being left by the roadside because there was no one to move them. The thing that makes this especially galling is that all this labour achieved almost nothing useful. If the British government had just given people food directly, nobody would have had to break rocks until they died. But that would have been charity, and would have created dependency. Better to make them work for wages that couldn't buy enough food, so at least they'd die with their dignity intact. Or something. The logic was insane, but it was consistently applied. The Protestant missionary efforts during the famine, superism, deserve their own examination because they're complex and still controversial. Protestant churches, mainly Anglican and Presbyterian, saw the famine as an opportunity to convert Catholics. They set up schools and soup kitchens, offered food and education, and in return expected conversion. From the Protestant perspective, they were saving souls and bodies. They genuinely believed Catholicism was false doctrine leading Irish people to damnation, and the famine was a chance to bring them to true faith. The fact that they also provided material aid made this seem like simple charity. And some of it was. Some Protestant missionaries were sincerely trying to help, offering aid without heavy-handed conversion pressure. But many weren't. Many made conversion an explicit or implicit condition of aid. You wanted soup? Attend Protestant services. You wanted your children educated? Send them to Protestant schools where they'd be taught that Catholicism was superstition. You wanted work? Convert first. The pressure was enormous, and for starving people the choice was agonizing. Die as a Catholic or live as a Protestant. Maintain your faith or feed your children. Some people converted. The supers were despised in their communities, seen as having sold out their faith for food. But what else were they supposed to do? Watch their children starve? The missionaries and their defenders argued that souls were more important than temporary earthly life anyway, which is a great argument when you're well fed and preaching to the starving. The Catholic Church fought back as best it could, warning parishioners against Protestant missions, maintaining their own relief efforts, and condemning converts as apostates. This created an additional layer of suffering, religious conflict layered on top of starvation. Communities split along lines of who had accepted Protestant aid and who hadn't. Families were torn apart by conversion. The famine wasn't just killing people, it was destroying the social fabric. The term super remained an insult in Ireland for generations. Even into the 20th century, there were families whispered about as descendants of people who'd converted during the famine. The stigma was deep and lasting. Better to have starved with dignity than to have eaten Protestant soup. This seems harsh until you understand that for Irish Catholics, their faith was one of the few things that couldn't be taken from them by British rule. Giving it up felt like the ultimate defeat. The international response to the famine was more generous than the British government's, which isn't saying much. Donations came from around the world: America, France, Turkey, Russia, India, the West Indies, even from the Choctaw Nation, who, as mentioned earlier, had just survived their own Trail of Tears genocide and still found it in themselves to help. Pope Pius IX donated money. The Sultan of Turkey sent aid. American churches and charitable organizations collected thousands of dollars. French intellectuals organized benefits. Russian serfs sent donations. This international generosity embarrassed the British government, or should have, but mostly they just accepted the aid and continued their policies unchanged. The American response was particularly robust. Irish immigrants in America, many of whom were recent arrivals, sent money to relatives back home. American churches collected donations. Ship captains carried supplies for free or at reduced rates. American newspapers covered the famine extensively, generating public pressure for relief. The USS Macedonian and USS Jamestown carried food supplies to Ireland, the first time the American military had conducted humanitarian aid missions. But even international aid couldn't overcome the structural problems. The issue wasn't lack of food or money, it was policy. It was the continued export of Irish-grown food. It was the refusal to interfere with markets. It was the prioritization of property rights over human lives. You could ship 1,000 tons of grain to Ireland, and it would just sit in warehouses while people starved because they couldn't afford to buy it. The problem was political, not logistical. There's a particular cruelty in the way relief was administered that goes beyond simple inefficiency. The Gregory Clause, passed in 1847, stated that anyone holding more than a quarter acre of land was ineligible for relief. Think about what this meant. If you had a tiny plot, 1 acre, half an acre, and you wanted to enter the workhouse or receive aid, you had to surrender your land first. This was your home, your livelihood. The land your family had worked for generations, even if you didn't technically own it, and you had to give it up. Voluntarily make yourself completely destitute before you could receive help. The Gregory Clause was designed explicitly to clear small tenants off the land and consolidate holdings. It used starvation as a lever to accomplish land reform. Landlords loved it. Now they didn't have to evict people and look like the villains. The tenants would evict themselves by choosing relief over land. The government loved it because it reduced the number of people eligible for relief. The only people who didn't love it were the starving families forced to choose between their homes and their lives. Thousands of families surrendered their land to qualify for relief. They gave up everything, became workhouse inmates, and usually died of fever within months. But at least the land was cleared. At least the holdings were consolidated. At least market efficiency was maintained. These were the priorities: property rights, economic efficiency, land consolidation. Human life was negotiable. The consolidation of land holdings was one of the few successes of famine policy from the British perspective. Before 1845, Ireland had millions of tiny subsistence plots. After 1852, these had been largely eliminated. The land was now divided into larger, more economically rational farms. This made landlords happy and fit British ideas about proper agriculture. It also meant that millions of people had nowhere to live and nothing to eat. But apparently that was an acceptable trade-off. Some landlords were more ruthless than others. Major Dennis Marn of Strokestown, County Roscommon, became infamous for mass evictions. In 1847, he evicted over 3,000 tenants from his estates. Entire villages cleared, cottages demolished, families thrown onto the roads. When his tenants couldn't pay rent due to the famine, rather than providing relief or reducing rents, he evicted them and paid for their passage to Canada on coffin ships where many died. Marn was assassinated in November 1847, shot while driving home from a meeting. His murder was never solved, but everyone knew why it happened. You couldn't evict 3,000 people during a famine and expect no consequences. The British government was outraged, of course. They saw it as proof of Irish criminality and violence. They didn't see it as the predictable result of treating human beings like disposable agricultural machinery. Other landlords tried to help, or at least didn't actively make things worse. Some reduced rents, some distributed food, some kept their tenants on the land even when they couldn't pay. But these were exceptions. The majority of landlords, especially absentee landlords who never set foot in Ireland, viewed their tenants as economic units that weren't performing adequately. If they couldn't pay rent, clear them out and find tenants who could, or convert to pasture and raise cattle instead. Cattle were less troublesome than starving Irish peasants. The Catholic clergy, particularly the parish priests, deserve recognition for their efforts during the famine. Many priests stayed in their parishes when everyone else was fleeing, administering to the sick and dying, organising what relief they could, and dying of fever themselves in large numbers. The priests were often the only authorities who remained in devastated communities, the only people trying to maintain order and provide comfort. But the church as an institution was limited in what it could do. It had some resources, but not nearly enough to address a disaster of this scale, and its theology complicated things. Some priests preached that the famine was divine punishment for sin, that the Irish needed to pray harder and reform their sinful ways. This wasn't helpful. Other priests focused on practical aid and kept the theological speculation to themselves. But the overall message from the church hierarchy was often fatalistic. This is God's will. We must accept it. Focus on the afterlife rather than this mortal suffering. The bishops wrote pastoral letters calling for prayer and repentance. They organised collections for famine relief. They pressured the British government for better policies. But they also maintained church discipline, refused to condone violence or rebellion, and preached submission to lawful authority. The church wanted to help, but within strict parameters that didn't threaten the social order. Feed the starving, yes. Challenge the system that created the starvation, less so. Individual priests were often more radical than their bishops. Some priests openly criticised British policy, sheltered rebels, or encouraged resistance to evictions. These priests were censured by their superiors and sometimes by the government. Being too political, too critical, too sympathetic to violence could get you removed from your parish. So many priests maintained a careful balance, helping their parishioners while not saying anything that would get them in trouble with Dublin Castle or the Vatican. The Protestant clergy faced different pressures. Some were genuinely humanitarian, providing relief without conversion requirements. Others saw the famine as divine opportunity for soul-saving and pushed conversion aggressively. Still others simply collected their tithes and did nothing, viewing the famine as a problem for Catholics that didn't concern them. The variation was enormous, ranging from heroic self-sacrifice to callous indifference. Let's talk about emigration in more depth, because this was the solution many people chose, not because they wanted to leave, but because staying meant death. The decision to emigrate was agonizing. You were leaving your home, probably forever. You'd likely never see your family again. You were boarding a disease-ridden ship with maybe a 30% chance of dying on the voyage. You were heading to a place where you knew no one, had no skills that would transfer, and would face discrimination and poverty. But you'd be alive, probably, and you might eventually make enough money to send some back to family members still in Ireland. Maybe you could save enough to bring them over too. Maybe. The calculus was brutal. Certain death if you stay versus probable suffering but possible survival if you leave. The mechanics of emigration were nightmarish. First, you needed money for passage. This could be 3 to 5 alms, which sounds small but was impossible for people who'd sold everything just to buy food. Many landlords paid their tenants passage, not out of generosity but because it was cheaper to ship them to America than to support them in workhouses. If your landlord paid your passage, it came with the implicit understanding that you'd never return and never claim any rights to the land. Some families sold everything they had, furniture, tools, clothing, to scrape together passage money for 1 or 2 members, usually young adults, the ones most likely to survive and find work. Children and elderly stayed behind, often ending up in workhouses or dying. Families were torn apart by these decisions. Who goes? Who stays? How do you choose? The journey to the port was itself dangerous. You might walk for days with whatever possessions you could carry, passing through countryside full of fever and bandits. The ports, Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, were chaotic and predatory. Ticket sellers cheated passengers. Boarding house operators charged extortionate rates. Thieves targeted emigrants carrying their life savings. You could lose everything before you even got on the ship. The ships themselves varied wildly in quality. Some were legitimate passenger vessels with proper accommodations. Many were cargo ships hastily converted for human cargo. The worst were barely seaworthy, overcrowded death traps that shouldn't have been allowed to leave port. But regulations were minimal, and enforcement was non-existent. If you had money for passage, someone would take it and put you on a ship, regardless of whether that ship was safe. The voyage duration depended on winds and weather. A good crossing might take 5 to 6 weeks. A bad one could take 3 months. During that time, you were in a cramped, dark, fetid hold with hundreds of other desperate people. You brought your own food, usually oatmeal or ship's biscuit, and cooked it on deck if weather permitted. If you ran out of food mid-voyage, you begged from other passengers or starved. Water was rationed, often contaminated. Dysentery was common. Typhus spread through the lice everyone carried. Children died first, then the elderly, then anyone who was already weakened by starvation. Bodies were wrapped in canvas and thrown overboard, usually without much ceremony. The sharks learned to follow emigrant ships. If you survived the voyage, arrival was its own ordeal. At Gross Isle in Canada, ships were supposed to be inspected before passengers could disembark. But the inspection station was overwhelmed within weeks of the famine ships arriving. Ships would anchor and wait for days or weeks while fever raged below decks. When you finally got permission to land, you might be quarantined for weeks more. If you were sick, you went to the fever sheds, which were death sentences. If you were healthy, you were released to make your own way in a strange country. In the United States, there was no quarantine system as organised as Canada's. Ships docked at major ports, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and passengers were released into cities that didn't want them. No Irish need apply signs appeared in windows. Landlords refused to rent to Irish families. Employers preferred anyone else. The Irish clustered in slums, took the worst jobs, died young from industrial accidents and disease. But they were alive, and they sent money home. The remittances from Irish emigrants kept many families in Ireland from starving. Between 1848 and 1900, Irish emigrants sent an estimated $34 million back to Ireland. That's an enormous sum, representing untold individual sacrifices, people working brutal jobs, living in tenements, saving every penny to send to relatives they'd likely never see again. The psychological toll of emigration was immense. You carried guilt. You'd survived when others hadn't. You'd left when others couldn't. You carried grief for everyone you'd lost and everyone you'd left behind. You carried trauma from the famine and the voyage. And you carried anger at the British government that had forced you to leave. This anger got transmitted to your children and grandchildren, becoming the foundation of Irish-American nationalism. The American wake tradition developed during this period. Before someone emigrated, the community would hold a wake, just like for someone who died, because you'd never see them again. There'd be music, drinking, crying, storytelling. It was a funeral for someone still alive, a way of mourning departure as death. These wakes acknowledged what everyone knew. Emigration was a form of death, the death of your old life, your old self, your connection to home. The letters emigrants sent back provide windows into their experiences. They're heartbreaking documents, full of longing for home, mixed with determination to make the sacrifice. Worthwhile. They describe working conditions, living situations, saving money, always promising to send more soon. They ask about family members, about who's alive and who's died, about conditions back home, and they almost universally tell relatives not to come unless absolutely necessary. America is hard, the work is brutal, you'll face discrimination, but at least you won't starve. Some emigrants succeeded. They found work, saved money, brought over family members, eventually achieved something like prosperity. Their children became teachers, police officers, firefighters, politicians. The Irish community in America built institutions, churches, schools, political organisations that provided support and advancement opportunities. Within 2 or 3 generations, Irish Americans had clawed their way into the middle class. But the first generation suffered enormously. They worked in jobs no one else would take, digging canals, building railroads, working in textile mills, mining coal. They died in industrial accidents at alarming rates. They lived in overcrowded tenements. They drank to cope with trauma and grief, which reinforced stereotypes about drunken Irish. They faced discrimination that was both social and legal. Businesses that wouldn't hire Irish, neighbourhoods that wouldn't allow Irish residents, political movements like the Know-Nothings dedicated to keeping Irish immigrants out of power. The irony is that Irish immigrants helped build the countries they fled to. They dug the Erie Canal, they built the Transcontinental Railroad, they mined the coal and worked the mills that powered the Industrial Revolution. They joined the Union Army in huge numbers during the Civil War, dying for a country that barely considered them human. They did the hard, dangerous, underpaid work that made American expansion possible, and they got minimal recognition and less gratitude. In Britain, Irish emigrants faced similar discrimination, but with the added poison of being in the country they blamed for the famine. Liverpool, Glasgow and London developed large Irish slums where emigrants clustered. They took the worst jobs, lived in the worst housing, and were blamed for every social problem. When there was crime, blame the Irish. When there was disease, blame the Irish. When there was unemployment, blame the Irish for taking jobs. The Irish were convenient scapegoats for all of Victorian Britain's anxieties. The children of emigrants had complex identities. They were raised with Irish culture and famine memories but were American or British by birth. They felt disconnected from Ireland, which they'd never seen, but also from their birth countries, which treated them as foreign. This liminality, being neither fully Irish nor fully American British, characterised the emigrant experience for generations. You belonged nowhere completely, carrying your displacement as permanent condition. The famine emigrants established patterns that continued for over a century. Even after Ireland recovered economically, emigration continued. It became normalised, expected. Every generation lost its young people to emigration. Every family had relatives scattered across the world. Ireland became a nation defined partly by absence, by the people who'd left and the lives they might have lived if they'd stayed. The demographic impact was staggering. In 1841, Ireland's population was about 8.2 million. By 1851, it was 6.5 million. By 1911, it was 4.4 million. The population just kept falling, decade after decade, through a combination of low birth rates, high death rates, and constant emigration. No other European country experienced anything comparable. Most countries saw population growth during this period. Ireland saw continuous decline. Even today, Ireland's population is only about 6.7 million, combining the Republic and Northern Ireland. It still hasn't recovered to pre-famine levels, 180 years later. Think about what that means. The famine broke something so fundamental in Irish society that population growth never resumed at normal rates. The trauma was so deep that it affected demographic patterns for nearly 2 centuries. The diaspora became larger than the homeland. There are an estimated 80 million people of Irish descent worldwide today, compared to fewer than 7 million in Ireland itself. The famine created a global Irish identity that transcended geography. You could be Irish in Boston or Melbourne or Buenos Aires, maintaining culture and identity through distance and displacement. Irishness became portable, something you carried with you rather than something tied to place. This had political consequences. The Irish diaspora provided moral and financial support for Irish nationalism. They lobbied their adopted governments to pressure Britain on Irish issues. They funded revolutionary movements. They kept the cause of Irish independence alive in public consciousness. Without diaspora support, Irish independence might never have happened. The people who'd been forced out by British policy eventually helped overthrow that policy from abroad. Let's talk about women during the famine, because their experiences were both universal and uniquely horrible. Women bore much of the burden of keeping families alive. They were the ones stretching food, foraging for anything edible, begging, making impossible decisions about who ate and who didn't. They watched their children starve while producing breast milk from bodies that had nothing left to give. Pregnant women during the famine faced particular horror. Your body needs extra nutrition during pregnancy. When there's no food, your body cannibalizes itself to feed the fetus, but there's a limit to how much it can sacrifice. Many pregnant women miscarried. Those who carried to term often delivered stillborn infants or babies so malnourished they died within days. The ones who survived childbirth had to nurse infants while starving themselves, watching helplessly as their milk dried up and their babies slowly died. Contemporary accounts describe women begging with dead infants in their arms, carrying the bodies for days because they couldn't accept that their children were gone, or because they hoped the sight of a dead child would generate more sympathy and better alms. The psychological trauma of this, carrying your dead child as a prop to extract charity, is almost incomprehensible. Women were also more likely to survive the early stages of famine than men. This wasn't privilege, it was biology. Women's bodies are better at conserving resources during starvation. They have slightly higher fat reserves and different metabolic responses, so women often outlived their husbands, which meant becoming widows with children during a catastrophe that provided no support for widows. A widowed woman with children had almost no options. She couldn't inherit land. That went to male relatives. She couldn't earn wages at men's rates. She could maybe work as a domestic servant, but there were no jobs during the famine because no one could afford servants. Her choices were begging, prostitution, the workhouse, or death. Many chose death, either actively through suicide or passively through simply giving up. The workhouses separated families, which meant women were torn from their children. Mothers were placed in women's wards while children went to children's wards. You could sometimes see your children briefly during exercise periods, but mostly you were separated. The psychological torture of this, knowing your children are sick or dying in another part of the building and being unable to reach them, drove some women insane, literally. The workhouse records note numerous cases of women developing what we'd now call psychotic breaks, usually triggered by separation from children or news of a child's death. Sexual violence increased during the famine, because of course it did. Starving women with children were desperately vulnerable. Landlords, agents, workhouse masters, anyone with power could demand sexual favours in exchange for aid or leniency. Women trading sex for food for their children was common enough that it barely merited comment in contemporary accounts. It was just understood. This is what happens when you make people desperate enough. Prostitution increased dramatically in cities, driven by rural women who'd fled to urban areas and had no other means of survival. Dublin, Cork, and Belfast saw explosions in prostitution, with teenage girls and women selling themselves for pennies, just enough to buy food for another day. Many contracted venereal diseases. Many were beaten by clients or pimps. Many died young, buried in unmarked graves reserved for fallen women. The moral judgment around this was vicious. The women were condemned as sinful, degraded, lost to vice. The men who created the circumstances that forced women into prostitution, the men who bought sex from starving teenagers, they faced no judgment. The system that produced this situation was never questioned. The women were the problem, not the starvation that drove them to desperate choices. Elderly women suffered particularly during the famine. They had no economic value, couldn't work, couldn't bear children, couldn't contribute. In traditional Irish society, grandmothers were respected and cared for. During the famine, when resources vanished, the elderly became burdens. Not maliciously, families weren't cruel, but when you have one potato and 4 people, and one of those people is 70 years old and unlikely to survive anyway, the calculus becomes brutal. The elderly often got less food, which meant they died first. Some elderly women simply walked away from their families to die alone, removing themselves as burdens. They'd leave their cottages and go into the fields or hills to die of exposure. This was seen as noble self-sacrifice, which it was, but it was also a systemic failure. A society that forces grandmothers to die alone in ditches so their grandchildren can eat has fundamentally collapsed. Young women faced their own horrors. Teenage girls were particularly vulnerable to both sexual violence and forced emigration. Some landlords paid for young women's passage to America or Australia, which sounds charitable, until you learn that many of these women were essentially trafficked. They'd arrive in foreign cities with no money, no contacts, and no protection, and often ended up in domestic servitude that was barely distinguishable from slavery or in prostitution. The famine girls who came to America as domestic servants had difficult lives. They worked 16-hour days for room, board, and minimal wages. They lived in their employers' homes, usually in attics or basements, with no privacy and no freedom. They were sexually harassed or assaulted by employers and had no recourse. If they became pregnant, they were fired and left destitute. Many ended up in Magdalene laundries, religious institutions that imprisoned fallen women and worked them without pay under the guise of reformation. But some famine girls succeeded. They saved their wages, brought over siblings, eventually married and started families. They sent money home to Ireland, keeping relatives alive. They raised children who became Americans while maintaining Irish culture. They were the backbone of Irish-American communities, often more so than the men, because women maintained family connections, organised community events, and transmitted culture to the next generation. The nursing and care work during the famine fell overwhelmingly to women. Women nursed sick family members, often contracting fever themselves. Women washed the dead and prepared bodies for burial. Women took in orphaned children when they could barely feed their own. The emotional labour and physical care work that kept any semblance of society functioning was women's work, unpaid and unrecognised. Religious. Sisters, nuns, played significant roles in relief efforts. Orders like the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Charity ran hospitals, schools and orphanages. They cared for fever patients, fed starving children, and organised relief distribution. Many nuns died of typhus contracted while caring for patients. They were doing heroic work, genuinely trying to help, though always within the constraints of church doctrine and social respectability. The famine also disrupted traditional gender roles in ways that had lasting effects. Women who'd survived by taking charge, making decisions, managing resources, they didn't easily return to submissive roles when the crisis ended. The post-famine Irish woman was different from her pre-famine grandmother. Harder, more pragmatic, less romantic about marriage and family. She'd seen what happened when you depended on men who could die or leave, and she adjusted accordingly. This contributed to the changing marriage patterns we mentioned earlier. Women became more selective about marriage. Why marry young and have many children when children starve? Why depend on a husband when husbands die and leave you destitute? Better to wait, to be cautious, to have fewer children you can actually feed. This was a rational response to trauma, but it also meant lower birth rates and slower population recovery. Now let's talk about disease specifically, because while starvation killed many, disease killed more. Typhus, famine fever, was the main killer. It's caused by bacteria carried by body lice, and it spreads through overcrowding and poor hygiene. When you have thousands of unwashed, lice-infested people crammed into workhouses, ships and cottages, typhus spreads like wildfire. The symptoms start with high fever, headache and muscle pain. You feel like you're burning alive. Then comes the rash, small red spots spreading across your torso. Then delirium. You hallucinate, thrash, don't recognize your family. Your organs begin shutting down. If you survive, and many didn't, recovery takes months and leaves you permanently weakened. Typhus killed indiscriminately, but it particularly targeted anyone in close contact with the sick. Doctors, nurses, priests, workhouse staff, they died at horrific rates. Dr. Daniel Donovan in Skibbereen treated hundreds of fever patients and survived. Dr. Richard Grattan in Cork died of typhus while treating patients. The death rate among medical professionals was so high that doctors were reluctant to work in fever hospitals, and you can't exactly blame them. They were being asked to commit suicide for minimal pay. Relapsing fever was another louse-borne disease that resembled typhus, but had a distinctive pattern. Fever for several days, then apparent recovery, then relapse. You'd think you were getting better, start eating again, then the fever would return, often worse. The relapses could continue for weeks, each one weakening you further until you died of exhaustion. Dysentery, bloody flux, was common in workhouses and ships. It's caused by bacteria in contaminated water and food, and it causes severe diarrhea and dehydration. When you're already weakened by starvation, dysentery can kill you in days. You dehydrate, your electrolytes crash, your organs shut down, and there was no treatment beyond trying to keep you hydrated, which was difficult when clean water was scarce. Cholera arrived in 1849, adding another layer of horror. Cholera is vicious. It causes explosive diarrhea and vomiting that can kill through dehydration in less than 24 hours. You can go from healthy to dead in a single day. The 1849 cholera epidemic killed thousands who'd survived the famine itself. People who'd made it through years of starvation only to die of disease during the recovery period. The diseases compounded each other. If you had typhus, you were bedridden, which meant you couldn't work or forage for food, which meant you starved faster. If you had dysentery, you couldn't absorb nutrients even if you had food. If you had cholera, you died too quickly for any intervention to help. The diseases and starvation worked together, each making the other more deadly. Scurvy appeared due to vitamin C deficiency from the potato-only diet. Your gums bleed, your teeth loosen and fall out. Old wounds reopen. You develop spots and bruising across your skin. It's not usually fatal on its own, but it weakens you and makes you susceptible to other diseases. Many famine victims had scurvy in addition to everything else, just adding to their misery. The medical understanding of disease in the 1840s was primitive. Germ theory didn't exist yet. Doctors believed in miasma, the theory that disease came from bad air or moral corruption. This led to useless or counterproductive treatments. They'd bleed patients who were already weak from starvation. They'd prescribe mercury compounds that poison people. They'd isolate patients in poorly ventilated rooms, concentrating the lice and bacteria. Some doctors figured out through observation that fever spread through contact and that cleanliness helped. They advocated for washing, changing clothes, and isolating fever patients. But these practical measures were limited by lack of resources. You can't maintain hygiene in a workhouse designed for 500 holding 2,000. You can't isolate patients when there's nowhere to put them. You can't change clothes when people own only one set of clothes and no way to wash them. The fever hospitals, when they existed, were death traps. They were usually just buildings repurposed for medical use, old warehouses, abandoned schools, with minimal equipment and staff. Patients lay on straw mattresses on the floor, crowded together, sharing lice and disease. Nurses were often recovered fever patients who had no medical training and were just trying to earn a living. The hospitals were less about treatment and more about removing the sick from public view so they could die out of sight. Some remarkable individuals did heroic work despite the limitations. Quaker volunteers who nursed fever patients knowing they'd probably die themselves. Priests who administered last rites to hundreds of dying people, contracting typhus in the process. Doctors who stayed at their posts when they could have fled, treating patients until they died of the diseases they were treating. These people saved thousands through their sacrifices, but they couldn't overcome the systemic failures that made the diseases so deadly. The psychological impact of living through constant disease was immense. You watched people sicken and die around you constantly. You knew that any day you might develop symptoms. You couldn't touch or comfort your sick family members without risking infection. You lived in constant low-level terror, which is its own form of torture. The stress, the lack of sleep, the grief. All of this weakened immune systems further, making people more susceptible to disease. Children who survived often had permanent health problems from childhood malnutrition and disease. Stunted growth, weakened immune systems, neurological damage from fever. The famine generation carried physical scars throughout their lives. Even those who emigrated to places with adequate food never fully recovered the health they'd lost during the famine years. The immediate post-famine period, the early 1850s, was in some ways more psychologically difficult than the crisis itself. During the worst years, you were in survival mode, just trying to make it through another day. After the crisis passed, you had to confront what had happened. The losses, the trauma, the destroyed society, and somehow build a life out of the ruins. Survivors face profound guilt. Why did I survive when others didn't? Why did my children live when my neighbours died? Why was I chosen to endure when better people perished? This survivor's guilt was crippling for many. They couldn't enjoy their survival because it felt like theft, like they'd stolen life from the dead. The landscape was eerie. Entire villages stood empty. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries were returning to wilderness. Cottages collapsed into ruins. The population had been so reduced that many areas felt post-apocalyptic. You could walk for miles and see only abandoned buildings and overgrown gardens. Ireland had become a country of ghosts. Reconstruction was slow and painful. Farming had to resume, but with what resources? Many farmers had eaten their seed potatoes. Draft animals had been slaughtered for food. Tools had been pawned or sold. Even if you had land, you might lack the basic equipment to work it. The British government provided minimal assistance for reconstruction. They'd moved on, considered the crisis over, and expected people to just get back to work. The potato crop gradually recovered through the 1850s as farmers learned to plant multiple varieties and implement crop rotation. But nobody trusted potatoes anymore. People diversified their diets as much as their poverty allowed. They grew oats and barley and vegetables. They kept chickens and pigs again. The complete dependence on potatoes was broken, though potatoes remained a staple, because they remained the most efficient crop for small plots. The land ownership system began slowly changing. The Encumbered Estates Act of 1849 allowed landlords to sell estates that were bankrupt or heavily in debt. This led to a transfer of land ownership, though not to the tenants, mostly to new landlords who were often as bad as or worse than the old ones. But it started the process of breaking up the massive estates, which would continue through the late 19th century Land Acts that finally allowed tenants to purchase their holdings. The depopulation actually improved living standards for survivors, grimly. With fewer people competing for resources, wages increased. Food became more available. The brutal Malthusian logic that British economists had used to justify non-intervention during the famine, that overpopulation was being corrected, proved accurate in this narrow sense. Life did improve for survivors, but this was an improvement purchased with 1 million corpses. The social fabric had to be rewoven. Communities that had been decimated needed to rebuild institutions, relationships, trust. But everyone was traumatized. Everyone had lost family and friends. Everyone carried grief and anger. Building functional communities out of traumatized survivors was extraordinarily difficult. The post-famine period saw increases in violence, alcoholism, and mental illness, all predictable responses to mass trauma. The Catholic Church became even more central to Irish life during Reconstruction. It was one of the few institutions that had remained somewhat stable during the crisis. Parish churches had stayed open. Priests had remained at their posts. The Church provided continuity and meaning when everything else had collapsed. This centrality would define Irish culture for the next century. Catholicism became inseparable from Irish identity, partly because the Church had been present during the worst times. The connection between the famine and Irish nationalism became explicit during Reconstruction. The Young Ireland movement, though it had failed militarily in 1848, had established a narrative that would define Irish politics. Britain had let Ireland starve, therefore British rule was illegitimate and must be overthrown. This narrative was simplified and sometimes exaggerated, but it was powerful because it contained essential truth. The British government had let people starve. They had prioritised policy over lives. They were responsible for deaths that could have been prevented. The Fenian Brotherhood, founded in the 1850s in both Ireland and America, was explicitly a famine generation organisation. Its members were men who'd survived the famine or were sons of survivors. They were dedicated to armed revolution to overthrow British rule. The Fenians launched several unsuccessful rebellions, but they kept the cause of Irish independence alive through the late 19th century. Every Fenian who picked up a rifle was, in some sense, avenging the famine dead. The cultural memory of the famine was actively shaped during this period. Survivors told stories. Newspapers printed accounts. Artists created images. The famine became codified as a defining Irish experience, the ultimate proof of British oppression and Irish suffering. This memory work was both necessary and limiting. Necessary because it preserved history and honoured the dead. Limiting because it sometimes reduced the famine to simple nationalist propaganda rather than allowing for the full complexity of what happened. Some survivors wanted to forget. They'd endured too much and just wanted to move forward. They didn't talk about the famine years, tried to bury the memories, focused on building new lives. This was particularly true of emigrants, many of whom wanted to leave Ireland and everything associated with it behind. They'd become Americans or Australians or Canadians and didn't want to dwell on the horrors they'd escaped. But forgetting was impossible. The losses were too great. The trauma was too deep. Even people who didn't talk about it were shaped by it, in their anxiety about food, in their caution about marriage and children, in their distrust of government, in their determination to never be that vulnerable again. The famine lived in their bones even when they wouldn't speak its name. The generational transmission of famine trauma manifested in specific, observable behaviours that persisted well into the 20th century. Families who'd survived the famine developed patterns around food that seemed irrational to outsiders, but made perfect sense given their history. Hoarding food, hiding money, refusing to throw away anything edible. These weren't quirks. They were survival strategies that had saved lives, and they got passed down even when they were no longer necessary. Irish-American families in the early 20th century, 3 generations removed from the famine, still exhibited these behaviours. Grandmothers who'd never experienced hunger themselves because they were born in Boston in 1900 still saved every scrap of food, because their mothers had taught them to, and their mothers had learned it from mothers who remembered starvation. The famine reached forward through time, shaping behaviour decades after the crisis had ended. The language around food in Irish culture reflected this trauma. Waste not, want not, became almost a religious commandment. Leaving food on your plate was sinful, not just impolite. Food was sacred because it had once been unavailable. This created psychological relationships with food that were often unhealthy. Using food as comfort, as love, as proof of security. Irish mothers force-feeding children until they were uncomfortably full, because somewhere deep in their cultural memory, a full child was a living child. The famine also changed Irish attitudes toward land ownership in fundamental ways. Pre-famine, people had complex relationships with land. It was home, heritage, connection to ancestors. Post-famine, land became security. It was the thing that could save you if crisis returned. This drove an obsession with land ownership that characterised Irish politics for the next century. The Land League, the Land Acts, the various movements to transfer land from landlords to tenants. All of this was driven by famine memory. Never again would Irish people be dependent on British landlords for their survival. When tenants finally gained the ability to purchase their holdings in the late 19th century through various land acts, they did so with fervour bordering on desperation. People who could barely afford it took on debt to buy land. Why? Because owning land meant security. It meant you couldn't be evicted. It meant that if another famine came, at least you'd control your own plot. The drive for land ownership was rational given Irish history, even when it meant crushing debt and hardship. This created a society of small farmers who owned their land but were often cash poor and economically marginal. Ireland remained predominantly agricultural and relatively poor compared to industrialised Britain well into the 20th century. But people had land. They had security, even if they didn't have prosperity. And for a population that had watched landlords evict starving families, security mattered more than prosperity. The education system that emerged in post-famine Ireland was heavily influenced by both famine memory and Catholic Church control. Education became a path to security. If your children couldn't farm, they needed education to get jobs. The Catholic Church ran most schools and shaped curriculum to emphasise Catholic values, Irish nationalism, and resentment of British rule. Students learned about the famine as British-caused catastrophe. They learned that England was the enemy. They learned that Irish identity was tied to Catholicism and opposition to Britain. This education system produced generations of Irish nationalists. Young people who'd never experienced the famine personally, but had been taught to remember it, to be angry about it, to see British rule as murderous. The classroom became a space where famine memory was institutionalised and transmitted. Every Irish child learned about Black 47, about the coffin ships, about the million dead, and they learned that this was Britain's fault. The Irish language revival movement, which gained momentum in the late 19th century, was partly a response to famine-era language loss. Activists like Douglas Hyde and organisations like the Gaelic League worked to preserve and revive Irish language and culture. They saw the language death that had occurred during and after the famine as cultural genocide. They were right, though. Whether it was intentional genocide or side effect of demographic catastrophe is debatable. The language revival had limited success. By the time activists started trying to preserve Irish, most of the population spoke English as their primary language. The native speakers were dying out. The cultural context that had supported Irish language was gone. You can't revive a language through willpower and evening classes when the economic and social structures that sustained it have been destroyed. Today, Irish is taught in schools, spoken in small western areas called Gaeltachts, and valued as cultural heritage. But it's not a living, thriving language the way it was pre-famine. The famine killed it too effectively. The literary renaissance that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Yeats, Joyce, Synge, O'Casey, all of these writers were processing famine legacy, though often obliquely. Joyce never wrote directly about the famine, but it haunts his work. The dead, the departed, the absent ones who left Ireland and never returned. Yeats wrote about a romantic, mythic Ireland that existed partly in reaction to the degradation of famine-era reality. Synge documented dying rural culture in the West, the last remnants of pre-famine Gaelic society. O'Casey wrote about urban poverty and political violence, both legacies of famine-era social disruption. For Irish Protestants, the famine created awkward dynamics. Some Protestants had suffered during the famine, particularly in poorer communities, but Protestantism was associated with landlords, with British rule, with the policies that had caused the famine. Irish Protestant identity became increasingly uncomfortable as Irish nationalism became more Catholic identified. This contributed to later partition. Protestants in the northeast saw themselves as British rather than Irish, partly because Irish identity had become defined in opposition to Protestantism. The famine's legacy in Northern Ireland is particularly fraught. For Unionists, the famine is Irish Catholic victimhood narrative that they don't share. For nationalists, it's proof that British rule is murderous, and that Northern Ireland should never have been left under British control. The famine memory feeds into sectarian divisions, with each community interpreting it differently. This shows how historical memory can be weaponized in contemporary conflicts. The modern Irish state's relationship with famine commemoration has evolved. The 50th anniversary in the 1890s was heavily politicised, used to promote nationalism and anti-British sentiment. The 100th anniversary in the 1940s was muted because Ireland had just achieved independence and was trying to build a forward-looking national identity. The 150th anniversary in the 1990s was more comfortable. Ireland was prosperous, confident enough to examine difficult history without feeling defined by victimhood. The Great Famine Commemoration Committee, established in 1995, coordinated 150th anniversary events. They built memorials, funded research, organised conferences, created educational materials. The approach was generally balanced, acknowledging British responsibility while avoiding simple blame narratives, honouring victims without wallowing in victimhood, examining history rigorously while remaining respectful of suffering. The international dimension of famine commemoration has been interesting. Memorials exist not just in Ireland but in cities across the diaspora. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Toronto, Sydney, Melbourne. These memorials serve different functions in different places. In Ireland, they're about honouring ancestors and remembering history. In diaspora cities, they're about maintaining identity and explaining why Irish communities exist there. The famine tourism industry raises questions about commodification of suffering. Famine museums charge admission. Famine tours cost money. Reconstructed famine cottages are tourist attractions. Is this respectful remembrance or exploitation? The answer is probably both. The commercialisation is uncomfortable, but it also preserves history and educates visitors. The alternative, letting the famine be forgotten, seems worse. The way different groups remember the famine reveals contemporary politics and identity. Irish Americans often remember it as proof of British oppression and justification for Irish independence. British people, when they remember it at all, often see it as tragedy that happened long ago and has nothing to do with them. Irish people in Ireland have more complex relationships. It's part of identity, but also something to move beyond. These different relationships to shared history show how memory is always political. The role of apology and acknowledgement in historical reconciliation is relevant here. The British government has never formally apologised for famine-era policies. Tony Blair's 1997 statement acknowledged inadequate response but stopped short of apology. Many Irish people and Irish Americans want formal apology. Many British people think apologising for historical events is pointless. This debate continues without resolution. Does apology matter? Would a formal British apology for the famine change anything substantive? Probably not. It wouldn't bring back the dead or undo the diaspora. But it might provide psychological closure, acknowledgement that wrong was done. The refusal to apologise suggests either that Britain doesn't believe anything wrong was done, or that admitting wrongdoing would open doors to claims and consequences Britain wants to avoid. Either way, the absence of apology perpetuates grievance. The question of reparations is even more contentious. Should Britain pay reparations for famine deaths? To whom? Ireland as a state, individual descendants, diaspora communities. How would you calculate appropriate reparations? These questions are nearly impossible to answer, which is partly why they remain unresolved. But the principle that causing mass death through policy should have consequences seems valid, even if implementation is impossible. The famine's influence on how we think about food security and human rights continues. The right to food, recognised in international human rights law, was influenced by historical cases like the famine. The principle that governments must ensure citizens don't starve, that market forces alone can't be trusted to distribute food, that international community has obligations to intervene when governments fail, these principles developed partly from famine lessons. Modern food aid programs, international famine relief efforts, and humanitarian intervention doctrines all draw on famine history. We know starvation can be prevented through timely intervention. We know governments can cause famines through policy. We know international aid saves lives. We know these things partly because the Irish famine taught them. The million dead weren't sacrificed for lessons. They died because of negligence and ideology. But their deaths at least taught something. The ecological legacy of the famine is visible in Ireland's landscape. The depopulation meant agricultural land was abandoned or converted to pasture. This actually benefited some ecosystems. Biodiversity increased in areas where intensive agriculture ceased. The ruins of abandoned cottages provide habitat for wildlife. The famine, through depopulation, accidentally created environmental restoration. This is perhaps the grimmest silver lining imaginable. The cultural memory practices around the famine, songs, stories, memorials, commemorations, serve important functions beyond simple remembrance. They maintain community identity. They transmit values across generations. They provide frameworks for understanding suffering. They create solidarity with others who've experienced oppression. These functions matter even when the historical details get simplified or distorted. But there's also danger in how famine memory gets used. It can justify violence. Generations of IRA violence were partially justified through famine grievance. It can perpetuate victimhood. Seeing yourself primarily as descended from victims can be psychologically limiting. It can prevent reconciliation. If you define yourself through historical wrong, you're invested in maintaining grievance. Healthy engagement with difficult history requires balance. Remember without being consumed. Learn without being trapped. The famine showed humanity at its worst and occasionally at its best. British policy was cruel and ideological, prioritising abstractions over lives. But individuals, Quaker relief workers, some priests and doctors, ordinary people sharing what little they had, showed remarkable compassion and self-sacrifice. The famine revealed both human capacity for callousness and for extraordinary generosity, often simultaneously. What would have happened if the famine hadn't occurred? It's impossible to know, but worth considering. Ireland might have had a population of 15 to 20 million by now. The Irish language might still be widely spoken. The diaspora wouldn't exist in its current form. Irish-American political influence would be minimal. The Easter Rising and War of Independence might not have happened, or might have happened differently. Britain might still control all of Ireland, or Ireland might have achieved independence through other means. Counterfactuals are speculation, but they illuminate how much the famine changed everything. The famine was a hinge point in Irish history. Everything before was leading toward it. Everything after was shaped by it. You can't understand modern Ireland, the Irish diaspora, Irish-British relations, or Irish identity without understanding the famine. It's the defining trauma that explains so much about how Irish people and Irish culture developed over the last 180 years. For many Irish people today, especially younger generations, the famine feels distant and historical. They didn't experience it. Their grandparents didn't experience it. Their great-great-great-grandparents experienced it. The emotional immediacy has faded. Ireland is prosperous, confident, forward-looking. The famine is something studied in school, not something that shapes daily life. This is healthy in many ways. You can't live forever in the past. But something is also lost when memory fades, when the lessons are forgotten, when the dead become just statistics in history books. The challenge is keeping the memory alive without being imprisoned by it. Remembering the million who died, honouring their suffering, learning from the disaster, while also moving forward, building better futures, not defining yourself solely through ancestral trauma. This is the work every generation must do with difficult history. Remember, but don't be consumed. Learn, but don't be trapped. Honour the past without being controlled by it. The ultimate lesson of the famine might be about human systems and human choices. The famine happened not because potatoes failed, but because humans created political and economic systems that prioritized markets over lives, property over people, ideology over compassion. Those systems were chosen. They could have been different. The deaths were preventable. This means that famines, historical and contemporary, are always political. They're policy failures, not natural disasters. They happen because people with power make choices that value wrong things. When we see famines today, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, the same patterns appear. Food exists, resources exist, but political conflicts, economic systems, and policy decisions prevent food from reaching people who need it. The mechanisms are different from 1840s Ireland, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. People starve because systems are structured to let them starve. The hope is that remembering the Irish famine makes us more likely to prevent future famines, that the million dead serve as warning about what happens when ideology trumps humanity, that we learn to prioritize lives over markets, people over property, compassion over economics. But humans are remarkably bad at learning from history, so maybe that hope is futile. We keep making the same mistakes, creating the same catastrophes, learning the same lessons and then forgetting them. But we try anyway. We remember. We commemorate. We study. We teach. We tell the stories of those who died and those who survived. We maintain memory across generations, keeping the dead alive through remembrance. We refuse to let the famine be forgotten, because forgotten suffering loses its power to teach. The million dead deserve to be remembered, not as numbers, but as people who lived and loved and hoped and suffered and died unnecessarily. So we come back to where we started. A potato, a lumper, watery, tasteless, nutritionally mediocre. The crop that fed millions and then failed them. The potato didn't cause the famine. Human choices caused the famine. But the potato was the mechanism through which those choices manifested. It was the vulnerable point in a fragile system, and when it failed, the system collapsed catastrophically. The famine killed 1 million people directly. It scattered another million across the world. It traumatized survivors and their descendants for generations. It changed Ireland permanently, demographically and culturally and politically. It shaped global history through the diaspora it created. It influenced how we think about government responsibility, human rights, and famine response. It remains one of the defining catastrophes of modern European history, and it was preventable. That's the thing that haunts everything else. The million dead didn't have to die. The diaspora didn't have to happen. The trauma didn't have to occur. It all could have been different if people with power had made different choices, but they didn't. They chose ideology over compassion, markets over lives, property over people, and 1 million people died because of those choices. That's the Irish Potato Famine, not a natural disaster, not an unavoidable tragedy, a policy disaster that killed 1 million people who didn't have to die, a catastrophe that was chosen, though no one would admit to choosing it, a crime that was committed without anyone being held accountable. The dead are still dead. The diaspora still exists. The trauma still echoes through generations. The landscape still bears scars. The memory still hurts. Nearly 2 centuries later, we're still processing what happened, still trying to understand it, still learning from it, still being shaped by it. Because some events are too large to move past, some wounds are too deep to fully heal, some memories are too important to let fade. The famine is one of those. It happened 180 years ago, but it's still here, still present, still shaping us, still teaching us, if we're willing to learn. The potato was just a potato, but what was done in response to its failure, and what was not done, that defined a nation, created a diaspora, and demonstrated humanity's capacity for both callous cruelty and extraordinary resilience. That's what we remember. That's what we carry forward. That's what we refuse to forget. 1 million people died, another million fled, and Ireland and the Irish and the world were changed forever.